version, Anna. Yeah. The Subcommittee on Health will now come to order. Good morning, colleagues. The Chair now recognizes herself for 5 minutes for an opening statement.
Parliamentary inquiry as we start this hearing.
Well, I want to do my opening statement. Pardon me? I already recognized myself, but I'll recognize you afterward. I never thought I'd be holding, or that we would be holding a hearing under these sad circumstances, but I think it's a necessary one. Our country is in pain. Americans are afraid, they're sick, they're hungry, and jobless, and over 80,000 souls have been lost. And the government that was supposed to protect them has failed. There are heroes, and they have risen. Extraordinary, ordinary Americans showing courage, compassion, and a sense of self-sacrifice and duty beyond hungry and jobless. And over 80,000 souls have been lost. And the government that was supposed to protect them has failed. There are heroes, and they have risen. Extraordinary, ordinary Americans showing courage, compassion, and a sense of self-sacrifice and duty beyond what could have or should have been asked of them. Regular Americans have risen when their leaders have not. We are the greatest country on earth, and yet we have the most cases and the most deaths from COVID-19 of any nation in the world. Why? First is the inept, ineffective, and extremely late effort to respond to what was clear to many scientists and public health experts in January. That basic delay cost precious lives and is continuing to cost lives. We can't have a system where the price paid is unconscionable. Mothers losing daughters, daughters losing fathers because of incompetence, denial, delay, and a disorganized response. Frankly, I'm tired of those who bear the responsibility accepting none of it while deflecting blame on others. The previous administration, the World Health Organization, the Wuhan lab, anywhere but where the blame belongs. Second, the United States has and remains dangerously dependent on foreign countries for our supply of critical life-saving drugs and life-saving equipment, masks, gloves, PPE, and ventilators. As a result, we can't treat our own people without relying on China and others to supply us. We can't outfit our first responders, our hospital workers, our nurses, our doctors. We can't care for our own nation in crisis. This surely is a national security issue. I want to thank the gentlewoman from Indiana, Ms. Brooks, for her bipartisan work with me to address the drug supply chain issue, as well as other members on a bipartisan basis for their legislation on those issues as well. Today, we're going to hear about the disastrous federal response to an approaching pandemic. Dr. Bright has filed one of the most specific and troubling whistleblower complaints I've ever seen. He was the right person with the right judgment at the right time. He was not only ignored, he was fired for being right. We can't have a system where the government fires those who get it right and reward those who get it completely wrong. Mr. Michael Bowen, the Executive Vice President of Prestige Meritech, will speak to America's crippling dependence on foreign countries for critical medical supplies, a public health issue and a national security issue. Our country is paying a terrible price today, and it rests on Congress to address this threat where any effort of an adversary can cut off our supply of life-saving drugs and supplies, our lifeline. And this would create a healthcare disaster on a scale never experienced before. I bear this responsibility, as does every member of Congress. This subcommittee has jurisdiction over our country's most prestigious healthcare institutions: FDA, NIH, CDC, and BARDA. We have to listen, we have to learn, and we must work together for the people of our country who need us so, so much, regardless of inconvenient truths. Finally, I regret that Secretary Azar, Dr. Robert Kadlec, and Dr. Peter Navarro have all refused to testify today. I now ask for a moment of silence in honor of the over 80,000 Americans who have lost their lives from COVID-19. The chair now recognizes...
Madam Chair, before I'm recognized for an opening statement, I wonder if I might be recognized for a parliamentary inquiry.
Gentleman is recognized. State is parliamentary inquiry.
Madam Chair, the inquiry is, I would like clarification. The witness before us today, is this witness testifying as a government witness or as an individual?
Dr. Bright is testifying as a federal employee, correct? And he is a federal employee representing himself. I now recognize the ranking member of the subcommittee.
Madam Chair,
yes.
just a question. Normally we have nameplates identifying who's at the table. And I know Dr. Bright, of course, but I'm not sure who's next to him.
You're correct. I don't know why we don't have nameplates. I didn't notice that when I came into the hearing room. Can the staff provide them? Is there any way the staff can provide them? I think we can. I also would like to inform the members that Dr. Bright's attorney, Deborah Katz, is at the table. She's requested a microphone. She is not here as a witness, so we will not be asking her questions. She is simply here to representing her client. I now would like to recognize the ranking member of the subcommittee, Dr. Burgess, for his 5 minutes for an opening statement.
I thank the chair, and the Energy and Commerce, particularly the Subcommittee on Health, is the premier health subcommittee in the Congress. We have a broad jurisdiction, a longstanding tradition of tackling important healthcare issues in a bipartisan manner. I personally, like our witness today, have been very, very concerned and in fact sounding the alarm about this novel coronavirus since January. So I ask, why is this the first official hearing that we're having on this topic? To say this is a disappointment would be an understatement. But not only disappointment, but quite frankly, I'm concerned it took 5 months to have a hearing on this novel coronavirus. Instead of tackling any of the issues suggested in the letters that I've sent to you this week, we are examining a whistleblower complaint that is only 1 week old before a proper investigation. In these letters, I outlined the importance of addressing the strategic national stockpile, COVID-19's impact on mental health, testing, certainly we should have a hearing on testing, racial disparities, and provider relief. The lack of attention to these details is detrimental to our nation's overall response to this pandemic, and it is the responsibility of this House and the responsibility of this committee. We continue to stand on the sidelines instead of becoming fully engaged. Every whistleblower deserves to be heard. Dr. Bright has raised serious allegations, and they deserve investigation. Whistleblowers must have their rights protected and deserve to have their allegations investigated with policies and procedures that have been long established, and upheld as independent and fair. Madam Chair, on April 23rd, CNN reported that you plan to call Dr. Bright to testify. Dr. Bright did not actually file his whistleblower complaint with the Office of Special Counsel until Tuesday, May 5th. That same day, it was announced on social media that you planned to hold a hearing, but it was not officially noticed until 2 days later. By Friday, May 8th, the Office of Special Counsel recommended that Dr. Bright be temporarily reinstated as director of BARDA so that it could thoroughly conduct its investigation and move forward with its usual processes of reviewing a whistleblower complaint. Despite the hearing memo, no final determination of a violation of a whistleblower statute actually has been made. Following a robust investigation process, the customary setting for a whistleblower hearing would be in our Energy and Commerce Committee under oath in the Oversight and Investigation Subcommittee. To say this hearing is premature and it is a disservice to the investigations of Dr. Bright's complaint, I think goes without saying. You trampled on minority rights. You would have never tolerated that when you were in the minority. You neglected the tradition of this committee, and in the manner this hearing was called. The number of procedural fouls committed in advance of this hearing would certainly have led the chair to foul out of multiple basketball games. Apparently, in a world without sports, this subcommittee has become political sport. More than 80,000 American lives have been lost to this pandemic. It continues to wreak havoc on our communities, not only in terms of physical health, but mental health and certainly financial health. We should be conducting a hearing on the real-time implementation of the Pandemic All-Hazard Preparedness and Advancing Innovation Act, and we should have done it in February. As a Democratic counterpart to the primary author, Dr. Susan Brooks, on this legislation, you, Madam Chair, should have a great interest in holding such a hearing. In my district, we've seen deaths amongst young African Americans from COVID-19. We're hearing about a new phenomenon of very young individuals who are dying from an intense inflammatory response apparently sparked by infection with this virus. Well, we should hear from some of these families and medical professionals to analyze why this virus has disproportionately affected some communities, particularly minority communities. So I've said it before, not all heroes wear capes. Hospitals, doctors, and other healthcare providers are on the front lines every single day battling this virus. They go to work so we can stay home, which we've done very successfully. The inability to conduct non-essential procedures and visits has led to financial harm to our hospitals and doctors. How are states and the country preparing to ease back into providing medical care? Is the distribution of the Provider Relief Fund in the CARES Act working? These are the questions we should be asking the experts today. I appreciate Chairman Pallone's willingness to hold telephone briefings since we all have our own questions. But let me just say, this pandemic is about the public health of our nation. I want to thank you for your commitment to hold future hearings on the Strategic National Stockpile, mental health and racial disparities. I'm happy to help you set the agenda for the rest of the year. I hope you will commit to additional hearings on testing and the Provider Relief Fund. And I request that my letters and your responses be part of the record. I yield back.
The gentleman yields back. I think the gentleman will recall that I called for a hearing on January 30th. And on the heels of that, it was to be with Dr. Kadlik, Dr. Fauci, all the heads of our health agencies, and it was Secretary Azar that said they cannot come. I'm the top person, and when I come, they will come with me. So that was January 30th.
Madam Chair, if I may, they managed to go to the Oversight and Government Reform Subcommittee for 2 days.
I'm not finished yet. Dr. Burgess. You've written several letters to me in the last week, and I've communicated to you. I'm happy to sit down with you to review and to come up with all the appropriate hearings that this subcommittee should hold. And we will work together on that. We have a lot of work to do. You're absolutely right. The stockpile, testing, The list is as long as Pennsylvania Avenue. So we will work together on that, rest assured. Now I'd like to recognize the chairman of the full committee, Mr. Pallone, for his 5 minutes for opening statement.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you, Ms. Eshu, for initiating this hearing and putting all your energy into it so that we're here today with Dr. Bright. We are here as part of the Energy and Commerce Committee's ongoing work to confront the largest public health and economic crisis of our lifetimes. As been mentioned, more than 80,000 Americans have lost their lives, while more than 36 million others have lost their jobs as of today. This is a national emergency that requires every aspect of government to work together to reduce the spread of this terrible virus so we can confidently begin to reopen our economy. And while this Congress and the President have worked together to enact 4 laws to combat the pandemic and provide economic assistance to the American people, new laws are simply not enough. President Trump and his administration have failed to provide the consistent and stable leadership that is necessary to guide our nation through this public health and economic crisis. For months, the President has delivered mixed messages and misinformation to the American people, creating confusion across the nation. Instead of showing leadership, competence, and vision in a time of crisis, the administration has abdicated its responsibility and forced states to fend for themselves and find their own way out of this pandemic. And while states and frontline healthcare workers were pleading for personal protective equipment, testing supplies, and other resources to protect them and their patients, President Trump's response was to let states fight it out on the open market. For months, the President has refused to develop and implement a national testing program. For months, we've been promised millions of tests were right around the corner. The promises have been hollow. Testing is getting better, but nowhere near what it needs to be. It doesn't help that the President proclaimed about testing earlier this week, and I quote, "We have met the moment and we have prevailed." That could not be further from the truth, Mr. President. Dr. Rick Bright, the former director of BARDA, has come forward as a whistleblower and made serious allegations, including a lack of urgency by administration officials to respond to the virus, mismanagement, and failure to procure necessary supplies, and disregard for public health and scientific integrity. His claims lie at the heart of this committee's concerns regarding the administration's response to the COVID-19 pandemic. We're here today to hear the perspective of Dr. Bright, who is positioned to discuss the administration's preparations and response to this pandemic. Now, the failures we've seen simply cannot persist. That's why the Energy and Commerce Committee continues to conduct robust oversight and to propose bold legislative solutions. We've been demanding answers and information from the administration on testing, contact tracing, the supply chain, food safety, and the safety of food production workers, and attempts to undermine science and public health. To date, we have yet to receive any sufficient responses from the Trump administration. And as for legislation, Congress has already passed 4 major coronavirus response packages that were improved by the work of this committee. And now, with the sense of urgency this moment requires, earlier this week, we proposed the HEROES Act, which is to be voted on tomorrow by the full House. The HEROES Act continues our ongoing commitment to providing the healthcare resources and support needed to combat the coronavirus crisis. Our legislation will strengthen testing and contact tracing by finally requiring the administration to develop comprehensive plans with clear benchmarks and timelines and public reporting of key metrics. This will allow transparency so we can see if the Trump administration is fulfilling their promises and hold them accountable if they're not. We also provide $75 billion to support robust testing, contact tracing, surveillance, and containment activities. This is beyond the 25 that was in the last bill. And we simply cannot beat this virus without these efforts in place. Our legislation also ensures that all COVID-19 treatments, drug, and vaccines are free of cost for patients. The bill will help us shore up our public health infrastructure for the long road ahead. Our top priority is the health and safety of the American people. The HEROES Act builds on the progress we have made and lays the foundation we will need to ease social distancing and safely reopen the economy. So I just want to thank Dr. Bright for coming forward and for being here today. I want to thank you, Madam Chair, for bringing him here. And I'm hopeful that this hearing will help us better understand the failures of the Trump administration so that collectively we can find solutions that will help us finally get a handle on this virus. It's the only way we'll be be able to protect the American people and safely and confidently reopen our communities. And I thank you, Madam Chair, and yield back.
The gentleman yields back. It's a
Madam
pleasure
Chair.
to recognize the gentleman from Oregon, the ranking member of the full committee, Mr. Walden.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. And before I use my time, I do have just a parliamentary question for you, if you would yield to that. Madam Chair, yeah.
You can state your parliamentary.
So
inquiry.
I know we're operating under really unusual conditions. I get
are.
that because of the mess and everything else, which also affects the layout of the room. I know when we do oversight and investigation hearings, I know that's not what we're doing here. There is a script about whether an individual is accompanied by counsel, whether they want that counsel represented. I've got that script. The reason I'm asking is we're not in O&I, but it is extraordinarily unusual to have a government witness as an individual with private counsel at the witness table and with a microphone. And so I'm just trying to get clarification for future precedent setting for the committee, and that's the only reason I'm asking this. He obviously have counsel. If we should follow the protocol that is prescribed for the Oversight and Investigations Committee in similar circumstances.
Well, I think this is the first time that
that's
it
why
is.
I asked.
We have another first here. When Dr. Bright came in this morning with his attorney, she requested the microphone. And so as a courtesy, I extended the microphone to her.
Yeah, sure.
Now, she's not a witness. She will not, we are not going to ask her questions. She's simply accompanying her client. So I don't, is it a
I have no
problem?
objection to any of that. It's just that, could I read you what this text is and maybe that resolves it?
Well, this isn't O&I. This is, are
Right,
you
but-
suggesting that we need to follow what O&I does?
I'm just saying that it is, the witness is not here in his whistleblowing capacity, is what I'm told, is what you indicated. But this is his personal attorney, if I understand correctly, but we still don't even know for sure. I know who you are, but we haven't identified that for the record. And all we do in O&I, as you know, is you ask if the witness wants to be accompanied by counsel, they respond, yes or no, and then counsel is allowed to move forward, sit at the table, and then the question is asked, will you give testimony or not? And if so, raise your hand, do all these things. That's all I'm doing here, is just, we don't usually do this type of activity in the other policy committees. And we are not usually set up this way, but because
would you
of the
like to ask
pandemic we
the,
are. I just think we ought to follow that for future precedent issues. Nothing to do with this hearing, but future precedent is what we're dealing with.
It's a good suggestion.
We're all learning how to operate in this environment.
Exactly. All right, the gentleman is recognized for his 5 minutes for an opening statement.
Well,
You
are
don't
we
think it's
going-
resolved?
Well, are we going to ask if he wants to be represented by counsel, and then who the counsel is?
Dr. Bright, do you wish to be represented by counsel?
Yes.
Okay. And then could she identify herself for the record?
And for the record, would counsel please state your name?
My name is Deborah Katz. I'm an attorney representing Dr. Rick Bright with the law firm of Katz, Marshall, and Banks.
All right.
Thank you.
I think that's all we needed to do.
Good.
Can I, Parliament?
All right,
can I
the
ask a
gentleman,
question?
well, the
Madam
gentleman is
Chairwoman?
recognized for his 5
Well,
minutes.
if you've got a parliamentary.
Parliamentary question.
Takes precedent.
The gentleman state his parliamentary.
Will the witness be under oath? Because if you have a whistleblower testimony under O&I, a witness would normally be under oath, and if not today, he's under oath, not under oath, then if we get into whistleblower allegations, how can we be assured that the witness is telling the truth under oath if they're not under oath? And if they're not under oath, then how can you talk about the whistleblower complaints
I thank the
in
gentleman
a
for his-
fair and equitable manner?
I thank the gentleman for his inquiry. All witnesses know that it is illegal to lie to Congress. And in our subcommittee, unlike O&I, they are the only subcommittee that I mean, it's a practice.
That's true.
It's a tradition, but we don't swear people in. But witnesses know that it is illegal to lie to Congress.
USC 1003 or something, I believe. So
Thank you.
I'm ready.
Most welcome.
Thank you.
Gentleman is recognized for his 5 minutes.
Well, thank you, Madam
opening.
Chair. And I
Certainly.
know we're operating under unique circumstances. So the world is coping with an historic, deadly pandemic that we always knew was possible, but we prayed would not happen. In a bipartisan way, we did everything the experts said we needed to do to be prepared should a pandemic or other hazard strike. Madam Chair, the work you, Dr. Burgess, Representative Susan Brooks, and I and others did over 2 Congresses, when each party has controlled the House, resulted in one product, the Pandemic All Hazards Preparedness Act. Dr. Bright, I know you were part of our efforts in writing and reauthorizing that law, and we thank you for your work. In fact, given the role you once played at ASPR before going to BARDA, you had a big responsibility to make sure Congress provided the strategic national stockpile that it needed, or to inform us if there were shortcomings, especially as we were modernizing the Pandemic All Hazards Preparedness Act. I went back over 3 hearings we held in the Oversight and Investigation Subcommittee of this committee, where you testified regarding the Zika outbreak in May 23rd of 2017, the seasonal flu on March 8th, 2018, and the hearing on June 15th, 2018, entitled The State of U.S. Public Health Biopreparedness, Responding to Biological Attacks, Pandemics, and Emerging Infectious Disease Outbreaks. You see, I wanted to make sure we hadn't missed anything. Nothing jumped out at me as I reread the records. Congress dramatically increased funding to ASPR and BARDA. We granted new authorities. We followed your recommendations and those of others who played a key role in this combined effort. Unfortunately, some of the systems we put in place to prepare for a pandemic, systems designed without actually living through something like this, have not performed as expected. We've learned we didn't have enough of the basic supplies that we've always taken for granted. And while Chair Eshoo and I have warned about the potential vulnerabilities of our medical supply chains, especially from China, not enough was done to address the problem, and it still hasn't been fully addressed. I'm thankful that President Trump invoked the Defense Production Act to ramp up U.S. manufacturing of masks and ventilators. And the President's used the emergency powers and money Congress has provided to launch unprecedented efforts to search the globe for supplies, to rapidly advance development of treatments and vaccines. But we still have much bipartisan work to do to respond and adapt to the challenges presented by COVID-19 and the lessons we're learning. We have asked for, and this committee should hold hearings to find a path forward to reform the strategic national stockpile, to increase domestic manufacturing of critical supplies and disentangle our supply chains from China. We should be exploring strategies for increased testing so we can begin to safely reopen our economy. We need to find ways to improve access to mental health and provide relief both for our healthcare providers on the front lines treating COVID-19 cases and our healthcare workers who have been furloughed because their hospitals are closed. We should be conducting rigorous oversight of the trillions of dollars and myriad new policies Congress has appropriated and enacted in the last 3 months, and we should be really investigating allegations like Dr. Bright's that raise concern about our nation's coronavirus response. That does not appear to be why we're actually here today, and frankly, it saddens me. Dr. Bright, your allegations are serious. They deserve a real investigation. I know the Office of Special Counsel with whom you filed your complaint will do just that, and I know they take their work seriously and will hear you out, and importantly, will give those named in your complaint an opportunity to have their side heard as well. I must tell you that many of us on our committee were confused when we learned from a tweet this hearing was scheduled in the wake of your complaint. As you know, that's certainly not how we do things at the Energy and Commerce Committee. Not long after the notice of this being a whistleblower hearing, we were advised you were here as a government witness, not a whistleblower, but then we were told you were not representing the government, but yourself. The hearing title suggests the hearing's about protecting scientific integrity, yet the chair invited a witness who will not be speaking to that issue. So it's all pretty confusing and unusual to say the least. Here we are in the middle of a pandemic, and we aren't given time to secure our witnesses, conduct appropriate research, or require documents that could aid in our understanding of the situation you face and the country face. Our first discussion with the majority, unfortunately, just occurred 3 days ago. Look, this is really serious business, but in my opinion, this is not the way we should run an investigation. We need to get to the heart of the matter And we need to look forward to see what haven't we done right as a Congress and a country, and what can we band together and fix before fall arrives. And so I thank you for being here. I've enjoyed working with you over the years, and continue to look forward to working with you and others to get this right. And Madam Chair, we have a letter for you asking for a Rule 11 hearing that we'll provide to you. And with that, I yield back.
Thank you. The gentleman yields back. The chair would like to remind members that pursuant to committee rules, all members' written opening statements will be made part of the record. I would now like to introduce our witness, the first panel today. Dr. Rick Bright is a highly regarded scientist with expertise in the fields of immunology, therapeutics, vaccine, and diagnostic development. For the last decade, he's been a career civil servant at the Department of Health and Human Services. In 2016, Dr. Bright was appointed Director of BARDA, the third Director of BARDA, the Biomedical Advanced Research and Development Authority. As Director of BARDA, he has testified before Congress as a government expert numerous times, including before this subcommittee. I share a special pride with Senator Richard Burr because together it was our legislation that created BARDA. So thank you for your willingness to join us today and to offer testimony, Dr. Bright. We look forward to your testimony. You're certainly familiar with the lights. I don't need to explain those to you. You have 5 minutes for your statement. Welcome, and got the microphone on? There we go. Good morning to you.
Good morning, Chairwoman Eshoo and Ranking Member Burgess and distinguished members of the subcommittee. I am Dr. Rick Bright, a career public servant and a scientist who has spent 25 years of my career focused on addressing pandemic outbreaks. I have a bachelor's degree in biology and physical sciences and a PhD in immunology and molecular pathogenesis. I've led teams of scientists developing drugs, vaccines, and diagnostics in government, private industry, and for nonprofit organizations. I'm here today in my private capacity. The views are my own and not those of the Department of Health and Human Services. I joined BARDA in 2010, and for the last 3.5 years, until April 21st of this year, I had the privilege of serving as its director. BARDA partners with private industry and others in governments to address national health security threats. Today, the world is confronting a public health emergency unlike any we've seen in over a century. We are facing a highly transmissible and deadly virus which not only claims lives but also disrupts the very foundations of our society. The American healthcare system is being taxed to the limit. Our economy is spiraling downward, and our population is being paralyzed by fear stemming from a lack of a coordinated response and a dearth of accurate, clear communication about the path forward. Americans yearn to get back to work, to open their businesses, and to provide for their families. I get that. However, what we do must be done carefully and with guidance from the best scientific minds. Our window of opportunity is closing. If we fail to improve our response now, based on science, I fear the pandemic will get worse and be prolonged. There will be likely a resurgence of COVID-19 this fall. It'll be greatly compounded by the challenges of seasonal influenza. Without better planning, 2020 could be the darkest winter in modern history. First and foremost, we need to be truthful with the American people. Americans deserve the truth. The truth must be based on science. We have the world's greatest scientists. Let us lead. Let us speak without fear of retribution. We must listen. Each of us can and must do our part now. On Tuesday, Dr. Fauci delivered a message in a voice that is clear and trustworthy as he encouraged us to act with caution as we return to our daily lives. We should listen to him and other scientists sharing their expertise. While waiting for a cure and a vaccine, which I believe will come, there are things we must do immediately. We must increase the public education about the basics: washing hands, social distancing, appropriate face covering. They're simple but critical steps to buy valuable time until there's vaccine. We need to ramp up production of essential equipment and supplies, including raw materials and critical components. Shortages of these increase the risk of our frontline healthcare workers, and they deserve the best equipment to protect themselves. We need to facilitate equitable distribution of essential equipment and supplies. And finally, we need a national testing strategy. The virus is here. It's everywhere. We need to be able to find it, isolate it, and stop it. We need to have the right testing for everyone who needs it. We need to be able to trace contacts, isolate, quarantine, and appropriately while striving to develop a cure. Initially, our nation was not as prepared as we should have been, as we could have been. Some scientists raised early warning signals that were overlooked, and pages from our pandemic playbook were ignored by some in leadership. There will be plenty of time to look back to assess what has happened so we can improve. But right now, we need to focus on getting things right going forward. We need a comprehensive plan that everyone knows and everyone participates in. Congress has taken important steps to support the response, and there's much more we can do. With your help, we can get through this crisis. Working cooperatively with our global partners, we can and will succeed in finding a cure for COVID-19. But that success depends on what we do today. We will either be remembered for what we did or for what we failed to do to address this crisis. I call on all of us to act, to ensure the health, safety, and prosperity of all Americans. You can count on me to do my part. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Bright. We'll now move to member questions, and I recognize myself for 5 minutes for questions. Thank you again, Dr. Bright. You have a distinguished career. You're one of our country's leading public health experts on how to respond to pandemics and national security health threats. You're the first government official who's been on the inside, seen everything firsthand, to come forward and share unvarnished experiences about what really happened from January to the time you departed BARDA in April this year in dealing with the virus. So I want to make sure I understand what you're telling us. You stated in your written testimony, a window of opportunity is closing, but it is not yet closed. What do we need to do with the time left to get it right? And if we don't, what do you mean when you say 2020 will be the darkest winter in modern history?
Chairwoman Eshoo, thank you for your question. The window is closing to address this pandemic because we still do not have a standard, centralized, coordinated plan to take our nation through this response. I believe with proper leadership and collaboration across government, with the best science leading the way, we can devise a comprehensive strategy. We can devise a plan that includes all of Americans and help us guide us through this pandemic. But time is running out because the virus is still spreading everywhere. People are getting restless to leave their homes, and we have to make critical decisions on how to balance the economy and science. My concern about this fall is compounded by my knowledge and preparation in response to many years of influenza outbreaks, pandemic influenza outbreaks, and seasonal influenza outbreaks. In our country in 2017, we had nearly 79,000 people die in the U.S. from influenza. That, coupled with a COVID-19 resurgence this fall, could be devastating for our healthcare systems and for Americans. We have a limited window of opportunity to get plans in place to address both of those.
Thank you. When you look at the first 4 months of this year, would you describe the government's and the administration's response as a success or a failure?
I believe we could have done better. I believe there are critical steps that we did not take in time.
Was there a failure to respond when you correctly pushed to claim early virus samples from, or to obtain early virus samples from China so we could develop critical medical countermeasures?
From my perspective in working with companies to develop drugs and vaccines and diagnostic, viral samples are critical. As soon as we were aware that this virus could pose a significant threat to human lives, I began pushing for those virus samples, and I met frustration and dismissal.
And when did you do that?
I did that in the office of the Secretary of Azar in January. The push for the virus samples initially mentioned on January 23rd, and a strong push on January 27th for those virus samples.
And was there a failure to respond with the needed urgency when you correctly pushed to ramp up production of masks, respirators, syringes, swabs?
Congresswoman, we've known for quite some time that our stockpile is insufficient in having those critical personal protective equipment. So once this virus began spreading and became known to be a threat, I did feel quite concerned that we didn't have those supplies. I began pushing urgently in January, along with some industry colleagues as well. And those urges, those alarms were not responded to with action.
Was there a failure to take immediate action when you correctly pushed to acquire additional doses of the drug Remdesivir, which is the only drug so far that has appears to be at least mildly effective, thank God, for treating people with COVID-19?
There was no action taken on the urgency to come up with a plan for acquisition of limited doses of Remdesivir, nor to distribute those limited doses of Remdesivir once we had the scientific data to support their use for people infected with this virus.
And instead of acting on your recommendations, was the response of others to try and cut you out of key meetings, marginalize your participation?
I was told that my urgings were causing a commotion, and I was removed from those meetings.
My time has expired. I now recognize the gentleman, the ranking member of the subcommittee, Dr. Burgess.
I thank the chair. And Dr. Bright, I hope, as it is clear to you, everyone on this dais on both sides appreciates you coming before us today, even if we are frustrated having this hearing without a full understanding of the facts. Again, just to clarify, you're testifying in your personal capacity and not on behalf of the agency or the administration.
That's correct, sir.
Great. Thank you for that. Let me ask you a question about hydroxychloroquine, really even maybe a little bit more broadly, the disease-modifying antirheumatic drugs that have been looked at for therapy for this disease. I ask about hydroxychloroquine because it does seem to be central to whatever disagreement you had with Department of HHS and the administration, but hydroxychloroquine was initially identified as a potential therapeutic because, number one, of its anti-inflammatory effects and its ability to calm things in the immune system. And as we know, one of the features of this disease is the overwhelming cytokine response that overwhelms the host. There also may be an effect of blocking the virus at the point of contact with the cell. Certainly something that probably deserves a little investigation. But again, it's not the only one. There were some other drugs, and I think, if I'm correct, BARDA supported with investments. Acterma and Kevzara, which are thought to have similar impacts on the ability to suppress the cytokine response as hydroxychloroquine. Am I correct in that?
There are a number of drugs that we were evaluating initially, Congressman, that we were considering to conduct clinical studies to get further information if they really had an impact and if they were safe to use in patients infected with this virus.
Do you have available to you the dollar amounts that BARDA appropriated or authorized for each of those two drugs, Acterma and Kevzara?
I don't have those numbers available with me now.
Would you be able to make them available to the committee?
I believe HHS could make those available. BARDA could probably make those investments available.
Were you concerned with hydroxychloroquine at the time you made those awards for Acterm and Kevzara? Was the concern with hydroxychloroquine, which became then paramount in your disagreement with the administration, was it already established when you made these other investments in similar medications?
My concerns around the safety of hydroxychloroquine in people infected with the COVID-19 virus were reflective of the scientific review that we received from an interagency group of clinicians and regulatory experts and scientists. At the time that we learned about hydroxychloroquine and chloroquine, there was limited data available, and our proposal and actions were to see if we could identify a source of that drug so the NIH could conduct a randomized controlled clinical study. That's a similar action we took with Remdesivir. Once we thought Remdesivir had promise from data coming from China, NIH quickly established a clinical study, a randomized controlled study to evaluate Remdesivir. And so with hydroxychloroquine, that was also our preferred plan of action.
And you, of course, authored the letter to the FDA asking for the emergency use authorization for hydroxychloroquine.
I was directed as a BARDA director from the Office of the HHS Secretary to put in place an expanded access IND program to make the chloroquine donation from Bayer available to Americans through a unique opportunity that would utilize an app and perhaps would make it available to Americans who were not under close supervision of a healthcare provider.
Understood. Of course, this hearing, not really a hearing on hydroxychloroquine. I, of course, would welcome a robust hearing on therapeutics and the research that's going on, what we've invested in, what seems to be panning out, what has not. I'll note that both Kevzara and the other medication may not have panned out. And I think the manufacturing company for Kevzara announced that they'll discontinue part of the clinical study because it looked unlikely to help COVID patients. But I will tell you, since starting this, since you identified yourself and this hearing got noticed, I'm hearing from a lot of doctors, my state, around the country, who have experience using hydroxychloroquine and chloroquine coupled with erythromycin and zinc. And they're reporting significant benefit if it is used early enough in the course and may eliminate the need for hospitalization and ventilatory support.
Gentleman's time
I don't
has
know if
expired.
that's right, but I think
gentleman's
it's
time has
important enough
expired.
that we should look into it and would just be interested if you did that as part of your duties at BARDA.
The gentleman's time has expired. The
May the
chair now
gentleman answer the question?
recognizes,
Would the witness be able to answer the question?
you may.
So I believe it's important. I've heard those anecdotal stories as well, and they were not conducted in the context of a randomized controlled clinical study. It's very difficult to understand data from those types of observational studies or anecdotal stories. So the drug might have some benefit in some populations, but we won't know that until we have that information from a truly randomized controlled clinical study. Many of those studies are ongoing now. Some of those studies we're starting to see data from, and those studies in those populations tested haven't shown an overwhelming evidence of benefit from the use of hydroxychloroquine in those patients. But the different studies are devised to look at different angles of it, as you described.
Yeah, most of those studies are at the end when someone is already
Gentleman's
critically
time
ill.
has expired.
You can't do those
The
studies
chair
without the drug, though, and you
recognizes
did need to
the,
acquire the drug for
ranking-
this, to
the
perform the
gentleman's
studies.
time, please. We all want to be fair to each other. The gentleman's time has expired. The chair recognizes the chairman of the full committee, Mr. Pallone, for his 5 minutes of questions.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And let me just say, Dr. Bright, thank you for your courage in being here. When I was younger, we used to read a book by President Kennedy called Profiles in Courage. And, you know, your courage in being here reminds me of some of the people I read about in that book. I am concerned, Dr. Bright, that the Trump administration does not have plans for a nationwide vaccine program to ensure that once a vaccine is approved, we'll be able to quickly make it available to everyone. In other words, I don't want to see the same mistakes by the Trump administration, the incompetence that they had with the supply chain and the testing, repeated with the vaccine. And you stated at the outset of the pandemic in January, you began urgently pressing HHS officials to provide the necessary resources to begin vaccine development, but that your pleas fell on deaf ears. And as the pandemic progressed, you also stated you were alarmed by the pressures coming from some administration officials for your agency to invest in drugs and vaccines, I quote, without proper scientific vetting or that lacked scientific merit. Can you tell us where we are now in the hunt for a vaccine and where we could have been had the HHS leaders made investment decisions sooner that were based on scientific merit?
Thank you, Congressman. As we all know, vaccines are very difficult to make. It's nothing that you can do quickly, and you need multiple shots on goal to try to make a vaccine. There are many diseases we've attempted to make vaccines for through history, and we still haven't been able to do so. So it takes many opportunities and many different approaches. Right now, there are over 100 different approaches for developing a vaccine for this coronavirus. So we're confident that hopefully, I should say, at least one of those or two of those will work, but you've identified key critical challenges that we need to anticipate and prepare for early. Number one is the supply chain for those vaccines, needed reagents and buffers and salts and the various ingredients that go into a vaccine, as well as the glass vials that the vaccines are put into, and needles and syringes, and then a carefully coordinated distribution and administration strategy. We haven't yet gotten to those downstream strategies yet in our government, and I think those are going to become a significant issue down the road if we don't plan for that now. The urgent need for funding at the outset of a pandemic is something we've known about through many years of pandemic exercises. Even in our August 2019 Crimson Contagion exercise, it was highlighted that we would need at least $10 billion from the outset of a pandemic to start the development of drugs and vaccines. Every day we delay delays the output of that vaccine or drug. And so in those early days, my first meeting with Secretary Azar, I asked for funding for people and for those viruses, the three critical things to get the vaccine started. It took some time to get the funding available through various processes. But what BARDA did is we began to look internally at other contracts and other programs we had to redirect some available funding, some minimal funding, to even as early as January, be able to initiate contracts or agreements with some companies to start working on those vaccines as soon as possible. It's because of those actions now that not only have those vaccines started and made some progress, but also the United States has a placeholder with some of those companies to be able to place orders for those vaccines when they are available. And we did everything possible to ensure that those investments were in companies that would build capacity in the United States to manufacture those vaccines. We had to get in line first, even when the money wasn't fully there to complete the development program. That's what we did.
And I guess my concern is, I've been very critical of administration in terms of their, I call it incompetence with the supply chain, with lack of testing. I'm afraid the same thing is going to happen with vaccines and the distribution. I mean, should I be concerned based on your experience?
Absolutely, sir. We're already seeing those challenges with limited doses of Remdesivir, with data that we're getting that Remdesivir has some benefit in people. And we have limited doses, and we haven't scaled up production, and we don't have a plan on how to fairly and equitably distribute that drug. If you can imagine this scenario this fall or winter, or maybe even early next spring, when vaccine becomes available, there's no one company that can produce enough for our country or for the world. It's going to be limited supplies. We need to have a strategy and plan in place now to make sure that we can not only fill that vaccine, make it, distribute it, but administer it in a fair and equitable plan.
And that's not the case at this point.
We don't have that yet, and it is a significant concern.
Thank you. Thank you, Madam Chair.
The gentleman yields back. I now have the pleasure of recognizing the ranking member of the full committee, Mr. Walden, for his
Thank you, Madam
5 minutes
Chair.
of questions.
And again, I thank the witness for being here. I want to get some clarification here. So BARDA's job is to do the vaccines, right?
That is one of BARDA's roles,
Yeah.
yes, to support industry to make the vaccines.
Okay. Is it BARDA's responsibility to direct the personal protective equipment acquisition distribution, the PPE? Is that part of your responsibility at BARDA?
BARDA plays a role in pandemic preparedness for our nation, and we prepare and align and exercise with our other federal agencies. We also are familiar with the critical gaps in the supply chain.
Okay.
So while BARDA isn't responsible for procuring those items for the Strategic National Stockpile, we are aware of those shortages and those needs. What I was doing in my capacity as BARDA director was raising those concerns and needs with the appropriate group within ASPR, the Strategic National
But
Stockpile.
ASPR basically has the responsibility to go do that, right? That's not your direct responsibility. You're obviously in this discussion, but that's not housed right in BARDA, correct?
It's my responsibility to raise a significant concern about a limited supply or a shortage that I think will affect the lives of Americans.
Did you raise that concern with people up here on Capitol Hill? And if so, who and when?
I raised that concern with my leadership, sir. I raised it with the appropriate folks in the Strategic National Stockpile and our Critical Infrastructure Protection Program.
Not up here?
My role was to raise it to my supervisor, Dr. Cadlick. I also did raise that concern, though, in the White House with Mr. Navarro.
Yeah, I'm interested because we're passing these bills. In the future, I hope you would, or anybody out there listening in these agencies, if you're spotting something that's not working right, we need to know.
Yes.
On the first case of SARS-CoV-2 in the U.S., it was identified, I believe, in January 22nd in Washington State. CDC put the positive specimen in culture that day, correct?
I believe so. I think it's January 20th.
Okay. It's my understanding the samples from the virus were made available to the U.S. government and that the CDC expanded the virus stocks between January 29th and February 3rd and shared the BEI on February 4th to enable broad sharing. Now, according to your complaint, after virus samples were available to the U.S. government from the Washington State case, and potentially even after the CDC's effort to grow the virus and then share with the BEI biorepository, you were still seeking to obtain a sample of the virus, correct?
That's true, sir, but we need more than one virus.
Right, I'm going to get to that. Why were the strains not available within the U.S. government, not available to you? Were they available to you?
Sir, I was asking for viruses in January because we wanted to make sure that we had a head start on developing the vaccine.
Yeah, no, I get that.
When they became available in February, I believe it's February 6th, through the BEI resources, then those were distributed to laboratories.
Did you ask for the virus sample from Washington State, though, as part
Absolutely.
of that? You did?
BARDA did. We asked to make sure we had access to those viruses, and they were distributed to the right laboratories and the right companies.
And where did you ultimately get the virus that you distributed sample?
Some of those viruses came from the BEI resources at NIH, and some of those viruses came from laboratories that received the initial seed from CDC.
Okay, that's helpful to know. In some conversations I've been a part of with some at NIH, they indicated that the real key here was to get the DNA sequence, which China did eventually put up, I believe, at the end of December, early January. And that in terms of going after the vaccine, it was that sequencing that really mattered most to get started on vaccine development. And there are other scientists who are very distinguished who believe that the delay in getting the virus sample actually didn't set them back. Is that an accurate assessment, or do you just have a disagreement in that view? And I know scientists disagree, so do we up here. But I'm kind of hearing that having the sequencing really mattered most, and getting the virus important, but did not set them back in proceeding to get the vaccine and vaccine development underway.
Sir, China posted the first sequence on January 11th, I believe, or made it available January 10th or January 11th. It's important to understand that the sequence is available, when a sequence is available, some companies with some technologies can get started with that sequence information.
And
you
did
still
they?
are vulnerable because you have another country in their laboratories that posts it on the internet or a database of their sequence. So there could still be challenges, especially for national security, about the integrity of that sequence.
Yeah, before my time runs out, it's run out. I was just going to ask, did they begin efforts at that time once they got the sequence?
The NIH began efforts on a synthetic messenger RNA vaccine candidate. However, without the viruses, you really cannot tell if the neutralizing antibodies
Right.
listed by that, or your diagnostics, or your therapeutics can actually work. You can try to synthesize a virus with a sequence, but it's never going to be representative of the actual virus. And when we're spending billions of dollars on drugs, vaccines, and diagnostics, we want to have the most credible information possible.
Right. Thank you, Madam Chair.
The gentleman yields back. Pleasure to recognize the gentleman from New York, Mr. Engel, for his 5 minutes of questions.
Thank you, Madam Chair, for holding today's hearing. Doctor, if you were a betting man, oh, sorry. Thank you. Doctor, if you were a betting man, when would you bet that we would that we would have a vaccine?
That's a very difficult question to answer. I know that there are companies in academic labs working very hard. Normally it takes up to 10 years to make a vaccine. We've done it faster in emergency situations, but from when we had starting material in the freezer for Ebola. But for a novel virus, it's actually haven't been done yet that quickly. So a lot of optimism is swirling around a 12 to 18 month time frame. If everything goes perfectly, we've never seen everything go perfectly. My concern is if we rush too quickly and consider cutting out critical steps, we may not have a full assessment of the safety of that vaccine. So it's still going to take some time. I still think 12 to 18 months is an aggressive schedule, and I think it's going to take longer than that to do so.
12 to 18 months from now, or 12 to 18 months from when this all started, the beginning of the year?
It would be 12 to 18 months from when the particular manufacturers first received the material or information that they needed to start developing that vaccine. It's critical to note when we say 12 to 18 months, that doesn't mean for an FDA-approved vaccine. That means to have sufficient data and information on its safety and immunogenicity, if not efficacy, to be able to use on an emergency basis. And that is the consideration that we have in mind when we talk about an accelerated timeline.
Thank you. I represent in New York, Bronx County and Westchester County, which are at the epicenter of the U.S. Coronavirus outbreak, New Rochelle, New York. While New Yorkers have really rallied together in support of their neighbors, the administration has failed at every turn. The President has sidelined our best scientists, pushed baseless conspiracy theories, and more recently prescribed unproven remedies like Lysol to suffering Americans. Since the early days of the outbreak, the President encouraged doctors to prescribe chloroquine to suffering Americans despite a lack of evidence supporting its use. On April 24th, the President's hand-picked FDA commissioner even came out against the use of chloroquine for COVID-19 cases. Doctor, what are the dangers of chloroquine if prescribed incorrectly, and what happened when you raised the issue of chloroquine use in coronavirus patients with HHS leadership?
Congressman, our concerns centered around the potential use of chloroquine in people who were infected with this coronavirus. There are data of the effective use and safe use of chloroquine in malaria patients and other indications. We also knew that there were potential safety risks with chloroquine to cause irregular heart rhythms and even in some cases death. So our concern was with limited information and knowledge, especially of its use in COVID-19 infected patients and the potential for those risks, then we should make sure that any studies with that drug were done in a carefully controlled clinical study under close watchful eye of a physician so they could respond to a patient if they did experience one of those adverse events. There wasn't sufficient data at that time to support use of this drug in patients with COVID-19 without close physician supervision.
And when you raised that issue of chloroquine use in coronavirus patients with HHS leadership, what happened to you? You were removed as a director of BARDA. Is that not True.
I believe part of the removal process for me is initiated because of a push back that I gave when they asked me to put in place an expanded access protocol that would make chloroquine more freely available to Americans that were not under the close supervision of a physician and may not even be confirmed to be infected with the coronavirus. The scientists at FDA, BARDA, and NIH and CDC worked hard to switch that to an emergency use authorization with strict guardrails that the patients would be in a hospital confirmed to be infected with this virus under close supervision of a doctor and who could not otherwise participate in a randomized controlled study. My concerns were alleviated somewhat by being able to lock that in the stockpile with those conditions. However, my concerns were escalated when I learned that leadership in the Department of Health and Human Services were pushing to make that drug available outside of this emergency use authorization to flood New York and New Jersey with this drug, regardless of the EUA. And when I spoke outside of our government and shared my concerns for the American public, that I believe was the straw that broke the camel's back and escalated my removal.
Thank you. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Gentleman's time has expired. Pleasure to recognize the gentleman from Kentucky, Mr. Guthrie, for his 5 minutes of questions.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Dr. Bright, for being here. We appreciate it very much. Reading through your complaint, I just kind of want to point out, I think the chairman said earlier, talked about the lack of urgency and implies the president's lack of urgency. I think most of my constituents want to know that things are getting done and where is the president on this. And you're having issues with the leadership at Health and Human Services, and you're giving them recommendations. So if they're not accepting your recommendation to them, I think fairly surmise they're not passing that on to the White House. So the president's probably unaware of what you're putting forth, because it says, and reading from your complaint on page 23, fortunately, White House Trade Advisor Peter Navarro shared Dr. Bright's sense of urgency. So that's in your sense of urgency. So talking about the urgency in the White House, so you have a meeting with him on Saturday. He calls you back in on Sunday, where you prepare your recommendations in a memo for Mick Mulvaney, Chief of Staff, so essentially the president. And then, so you get around the leadership of HHS, meet essentially with the president, since with Mick Mulvaney, and it says, you have the meeting with Navarro on Saturday, the memorandum of Mick Mulvaney on Sunday, and on Monday, it says the National Security Council Policy Coordinating Committee met and directed Dr. Kalik and HHS to implement Navarro's recommendations. The push by the White House for HHS to act more swiftly created tension between Dr. Bright and HHS political leadership. So it seems, I don't know how you could be more urgent in government than having a meeting on Saturday, a memorandum on Sunday, and actions on Monday, once it got to the president's attention, the president's level. So we appreciate the president moving forward on that. I'm on the ranking member of O&I, which the investigations, which you've testified in front of us before, and we appreciate that very much. So I'm kind of looking more at the process of putting this hearing together and some things. As we read through your complaint, the only way we have is because you made it public. And in your complaint, there are different exhibits that you talk about, and we're having a hearing today, and there are actually 33 exhibits referenced in your complaint that's not public. I think we got them from the majority through the Washington Post or something like that. That's how we were made documents available for this hearing, in my understanding. So the 33 exhibits that are not made public, that are referenced in your complaint, would you make those available to the committee? Do you have those and make them available to the committee? I mean, if we're using your complaint for this hearing, we need to have the documentation.
May I address that?
With the chair, I don't have a problem with you addressing.
Yes, we will take that under advisement and get back to you.
Okay. Also, when we read through the
There may be privacy considerations in some of the documents, so we do need to look at these documents carefully.
So also, if you read through the email chains that are made available, some appear complete, but some truly aren't. They're apparently not full email chains. And so you will wonder if the context of the email would relate to the inferences taken from the emails. Would you make all the complete email chains available to us?
I'd like to address that as well, which is a problem is when Dr. Bright was removed from his position, he was locked out of his email. He does not have access to his full email.
So the email change, so the email change that you have available, we have.
That's correct.
I can
He does
address
not have
this.
a full set of his email.
I can address this too, and that's exactly right. So I was immediately locked out of my email on April 20th of this year. And so I didn't have full records available to me on that. However, I believe I laid a solid foundation in my complaint, as detailed as I could be, for the Office of Special Counsel to be able to conduct an investigation. I believe as part of their investigation, they'll be able to access those emails and individuals to get a full story and get the full information so they can get to the bottom of it.
It would have been helpful for us as well. Have you shared any of these exhibits with the majority that's not been shared with us in the minority side?
Sir, I believe you have probably what's available in the public domain, and I believe the rest has been submitted to the Office of the Special Counsel, and I haven't made it available to anyone directly.
To the gentleman, the minority and majority members all received the same packet of information.
Which is available to the
Emails,
public.
yeah, that was available, that was in the public domain.
So just one more, are there any other documents in your possession or accessible to you that are not included as exhibits in the complaint, but are nonetheless relevant to your allegations? If so, will you provide those to the committee?
I believe I've provided the information I have available to me at this point. If I had access to my email from HHS, there might be additional supporting information in that email. I do not know the status, if that's been deleted or wiped, or I just haven't had access to it since April 20th.
Okay, what you have access to. I appreciate your answers. Thank you very much. I yield back.
The gentleman yields back. Pleasure to recognize the gentleman from North Carolina, Mr. Butterfield, for his 5 minutes of questions.
Thank you, Chairwoman, and to you, Dr. Bright, thank you, sir, for coming today, and thank you, most importantly, for your 25 years of public service. Dr. Bright, I'd like to ask you about your efforts to address supply shortages for administering COVID-19 tests. According to your account, as COVID-19 testing ramped up, you asked for an inventory of the strategic national supply availability of testing supplies, including swabs, viral transport materials, and extraction buffers. You learned that the national stockpile did not stock these items. After that, you learned that FDA's source of swabs was a manufacturer in the region of Italy, which was the center of the COVID-19 outbreak in Italy. It is my understanding that this information then prompted you to reach out to the DoD agency that had previously assisted your office with international transportation of supplies related to Ebola. My question is, why, sir, did your office contact DoD at this point?
Sir, it was quite a surprise to me that the urgent ramp-up of the testing did not include full consideration of all the critical supplies needed to support that ramp-up of testing, including those materials you mentioned, swabs, viral transport media, buffers, et cetera. And I was quite alarmed to learn from sitting behind CDC Director Redfield that we were going to experience this shortage of swabs. And I was even more surprised that our strategic national stockpile did not plan or have any of those in supply. So my urgency to find a solution to that was supported by the FDA director of the Center for CDRH, who does devices and diagnostics at FDA. And once I confirmed that there was a shortage, it was critical that we find a solution. And that was by partnering with our Department of Defense colleagues who work with us for the Ebola response. We actually work with them to ship doses of Ebola vaccine from Germany to the United States so it can be filled rapidly to respond to the outbreak in Africa. So it was a natural occurrence or response for me and my colleagues in BARDA to come up with a solution to that critical supply chain.
Let me ask you this, were there any restrictions in place in Italy that would require Secretary Azar to move forward with the request to DoD?
What we needed to enact that air bridge with Department of Defense was we needed our Secretary Azar to make a request of the Secretary of Defense. And I and my colleague, Dr. Gary Disbrow, raised this issue at our senior leadership meeting with Dr. Kadlec, who chairs that meeting, the ASPR. And it clearly was not a topic of that he wanted to discuss on that day, and actually we were rebuffed by him saying that he did not really want to talk about swabs right now. And both Dr. Dispro and I raised this concern repeatedly in that call. So knowing that it was critical and time sensitive, and we had a critical shortage of these swabs, I placed a call to Mr. Navarro's office once again and asked if Mr. Navarro could offer some assistance in contacting the Secretary of Defense to get clearance for DOD to put those airplanes in place under the contract we have. And that happened in a very quick turnaround, a matter of minutes. With that permission from the Secretary of Defense, we were able to start those flights within 2 days. We have now transferred back over 25 million swabs.
So you're saying that you alerted White House Advisor Peter Navarro about this issue, is that right?
Yes.
And within hours, literally within hours, he had coordinated with DOD to start these flights to transport the swabs?
Yes, sir.
Correct. This seems like a logical response to the analysis that you provided. What is truly perplexing to me is why anyone would resist such an initiative. That's a rhetorical question. I won't ask you to answer that. Finally, we still don't have enough testing supplies. I don't understand how and why that is possible. I understand that converting an auto plant to build ventilators might take a little time, but how can we be struggling to get adequate supplies of simple supplies like swabs? What does this say about the federal response to the coronavirus outbreak?
It says to me, sir, that there is no master coordinated plan on how to respond to this outbreak. We don't have a strategy or plan in place that identifies each of those critical components, and we don't have a designated agency that is sourcing those critical components and coming up with a strategy to make sure that we have those supplies when we need them. We need this comprehensive national strategy that's end-to-end about what includes every component to make sure we can respond and protect American lives.
Thank you, Dr. Bright. You're a great American. Thank you very much. I yield back.
The gentleman yields back. Pleasure to recognize the gentleman from Virginia, Mr. Griffith, for his 5 minutes questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Madam Chairman, appreciate that. It seems like Mr. Navarro's done a pretty good job in listening to the questions. I do wish we had more of the information available, and it's one of the reasons why it's not your fault, but why I wish we had done this through the regular channels. But I would ask this on some of the questions that were just asked about supplies being available. I kind of got the impression from prior testimony that Project BioShield, which you urged us to put money into, and we put $700 million in 18 and 735 in 15 and 19, was supposed to take care of some of that. Am I misunderstanding Project BioShield?
Project BioShield is used to invest in late-stage development of drugs and vaccines, primarily, and some diagnostics. And
so that didn't help on this at all?
It didn't help on this at all, sir.
All right. Now, that being said, and I did say, and I would hope that we would have had everything available to us, and I understand that may not be your fault, but it does create issues. But everything's going crazy. The people have all kinds of things going on. And this hydroxychloroquine comes up, and there's some email exchanges, and Exhibit 54 from your documents indicate that Christopher Houchins writes, and he says, we should probably take a look at this. I'm paraphrasing, but the line I took out of it was, especially when we have few or no options. One of the frustrations I have had for years with our community trying to respond to all kinds of different diseases is we want to have the double-blind studies in place. We want to have all the science there, which makes sense if you have an alternative. But when you have few or no options, it seems to me you would go after those things that are available. And if hydroxychloroquine is one at one point, then Remdesivir, I'm assuming, have they done the double-blind studies related to COVID on Remdesivir? Has that already happened? And then I've got an article from the Richmond Times-Dispatch, April 15th, where a doctor used high doses of vitamin C and a drug called Actemra, also an Actemra. All of these are floating out there. Doctors are using all kinds of things because we don't have other options. And so I'm wondering, what was the great hesitancy to at least let doctors try, and even if anecdotally it was having some effect, wouldn't you have to have that available in order to be able to do the tests? And if you've got few or no options, why wouldn't you want to go down that pathway?
We want to make sure that the drugs that we consider are safe and effective. The highest priority is safety. So many of these studies that we had, or anecdotal evidence or reports we had, did not include a thorough safety vetting of those drugs. There are some known side effects with some of the drugs. Many of these drugs were repurposed, so they weren't built de novo. So we knew about some of those potential safety concerns, and we didn't have any evidence of how those safety concerns would appear in people infected with this virus. This virus takes over a lot of your body and actually infects multiple organs in your body and causes significant inflammation and multi-organ shutdown in some cases before death. And acute respiratory distress syndrome, it really turns your lungs into a brick. And
It's
so there's-
scary stuff. And you said, though, on hydroxychloroquine that, one of the problems was you might have irregular heartbeat. If you're worried about not having a heartbeat at all, that's really not, you're not worried about irregular if you don't have one at all. Am I not correct about that? I mean, that's the concern. People were dying out there, and here was the first one that showed some promise. Why wouldn't we want to accept, an offer from a manufacturer to give us a lot of this and have it out there for widespread use if the doctors chose, just like the doctor in Richmond? That didn't work in that case. They actually used it in that case, and it didn't work. So he tried something else. I mean, I think that's really what we're going to have to do in an emergency situation. Am I not correct?
We need to do it carefully, sir. We have to make sure that when we have that information available, or those potential drugs available, we are thinking outside the box.
Can't we be so careful that we actually accidentally kill people?
We need to move swiftly, sir. And we've actually to show that we could put up a clinical study in the matter of less than a week.
Okay.
It's important to use the available clinical data. And if we know there are potential risks, we need to make sure that we're cognizant of those risks and make sure those drugs are used in a very safe and controlled manner.
Yes, sir. And I appreciate that. And let me just say this. It's our job to ask some tough questions sometimes, but just like you found friendly ears at the White House, you might have found some friendly ears on our side of the aisle here as well. And I would note that in 2018, you were talking about vaccines and you were talking about offshore production. And I said, let me know what I can do to help get more production onshore, but I never heard from you. I'm happy to help. I want onshore production. I'm with you on a lot of these issues. I don't know what's going on behind the scenes. We've got to investigate that. Today, unfortunately, was not the day to do that investigation. We don't have enough information. A lot of stuff is not here for us, but don't hesitate in the future. If you see something, let us know on both sides of the aisle what's going on. I appreciate it, and I yield back.
Thank you.
Gentleman yields back. Pleasure to recognize the gentlewoman from California, Ms. Matsui, for her 5 minutes of questions.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair, and thank you, Dr. Bright, for appearing before us today, and thank you for your public service. Dr. Bright, you described a series of missed opportunities that have left our country woefully unprepared for the pandemic's impact. Many Americans are eager to return to normalcy, as we can all understand. But to even begin safely reopening, we need widespread testing capacity, an organized contract tracing workforce, and a healthcare system that can handle further surge. And ultimately, a vaccine or therapeutic cure is required. I'd like to ask you a series of questions about your warnings to the administration while at BARDA. I'm hoping you can succinctly answer whether you believe each scenario will ultimately shorten or lengthen the time it takes for our country to safely reopen and recover from the coronavirus pandemic. On January 10th, you began pushing HHS leadership to obtain sequencing of virus samples. Given the importance of these samples for vaccine and diagnostic development, has the administration's inaction shortened or lengthened our timeline for reopening?
Those samples were critical to get started as early as possible. There was delay in getting those samples. That means there'll be delay in getting those countermeasures.
So
those countermeasures are critical to reopening our country.
Okay. Throughout the month of January, you made HHS aware of the urgent need to increase funding to combat the virus. HHS leadership believed that BARDA's budget was sufficient. Has the delay of these resources shortened or lengthened our timeline for reopening?
The delay of those resources have extended the timeline to make drugs available and vaccines. Sure. Therefore, it's extended our ability to respond to this pandemic.
On January 18th, you pushed Dr. Cadillac to coordinate COVID-19 planning activities across the government. Dr. Cadillac initially rejected your request, suggesting it was not time sensitive. Did this delay in coordination shorten or lengthen our timeline for reopening?
that lengthen the timeline for our reopening. We needed those early policy discussions to happen as soon as possible.
From January through March, you pushed for HHS to ramp up production of the N95 masks, swabs, and syringes. HHS failed to act quickly. Has this inaction shortened or lengthened our timeline to reopening?
That inaction has put a lot of lives at risk, and our frontline healthcare workers, in no time to reopen our country, will bring those people back to us.
Certainly. Thank you, Dr. Bright. Of course, there are many decisions made outside of these scenarios that influence when we can safely reopen. But from what I'm hearing today, HHS, if they heeded your warnings early, we could have proactively limited the toll this pandemic is taking on our country. It appears clear from the whistleblower report that the Trump administration prioritized political calculations above public health with regard to chloroquine and hydroxychloroquine. Despite the lack of data supporting the clinical benefits for the treatment and prevention of COVID-19, the Trump administration promoted the drug's use to the American people because it was seen as a big, immediate win. Dr. Bright, do you believe there are other instances where the administration relied on politics rather than science to make coronavirus response decisions? And what consequences might those decisions have had on public health?
We have a very rigorous scientific review process for all of the investments that we make for the drugs, vaccines, and diagnostics through BARDA and through our department, actually. And so there were some attempts to bypass that rigorous vetting process that caused me great concern and actually increased the tension between me and Dr. Cadillac. Without that scientific vetting, that does increase the risk of a drug being evaluated or supported that could have safety concerns. And we really needed to have the best scientists in our country weigh in on whether or not that drug should be evaluated and how it should be evaluated to address those safety concerns.
Certainly. The Trump administration waited until April to invoke the Defense Production Act to increase the production of life-saving medical supplies like masks, months after doctors began experiencing shortages, and 3 months after your initial January warnings. Should HHS have invoked the Defense Act earlier to increase the domestic production of critical medical supplies, like masks and swabs?
I'm not an expert on the Defense Production Act and how it's used most effectively. I do believe that we should have been doing everything possible, placing orders early, ramping up supply, ramping up production of those critical medical equipment as quickly as possible, whether or not that's through the Defense Production Act or other mechanisms. It should have been a high priority.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Dr. Bright. I run out of time, and thank you very much for appearing before us today.
The gentlewoman yields back. A pleasure to recognize the gentleman from Florida, Mr. Bilirakis, for his 5 minutes.
I appreciate it very much, and I want to thank Dr. Bright as well for your service to our country. I have a few questions, and I'm focusing on the hydroxychloroquine. When was the potential use of chloroquine and hydroxychloroquine as treatment for the COVID-19 first brought to your attention, sir?
I believe it's probably mid-March, between March 10th and March 17th, somewhere in that time frame.
And not prior to that?
Not that I recall. The first I heard of the drug itself was a call I received from Dr. Woodcock at the FDA asking if I'd heard of the drug. And I hadn't heard of the drug, and I hadn't heard of its potential use for COVID-19 patients. She said there might be something interesting to look at. And she forwarded a manuscript, a draft manuscript. I learned of the drug itself.
So you weren't aware of any news articles and research papers in January discussing the potential benefits of the drug?
I had heard anecdotal stories and reports, sir.
You had?
I had probably, I can't recall if I did specifically for chloroquine, but I tried to track the media and the scientific journal as well. However, I rely on the guidance of the science within HHS. And the first I had heard of that was from my colleague, Dr. Woodcock at the FDA, and then a summary report from our scientists at FDA, CDC, NIH, and BARDA that indicated that the evidence for its benefit was weak and the evidence for its safety concerns was stronger. And they did not believe at that point it was something that should be supported.
Okay, now, again, what was your reaction personally? Did you think it was something worth pursuing initially when you heard from Dr. Woodcock?
Initially, I said I do believe, I trust Dr. Woodcock and her scientific judgment immensely. And if she mentioned that this is something that we should look at, then it's something we should consider testing in a randomized controlled clinical study, I would be supportive of the team reviewing that protocol and that information to see if it should be used.
So, I understand, I've heard from experts, and I'm certainly not an expert in this area, that the drug, the one that we're talking about, in this case, hydroxychloroquine, if it's used, first of all, timely, because I understand there's a window there as far as the patient, the efficacy of the drug. Have you heard this, that if it's administered properly, there's a small window there for the patient as far as risk is concerned? Can you elaborate a little bit on that if you've heard that? And again, this is not from a layperson, this is from an expert.
We have seen heard of anecdotal data from different physicians that they believe they've seen benefit or patient improvement from use of this drug in either combination with antibiotic azithromycin or a combination with zinc or other vitamin C or other things, but there was never sufficient evidence from a randomized controlled study to show its benefit would actually outweigh the potential risk. That is why the NIH and probably 40 other institutions around the world are conducting randomized controlled clinical studies to look at the benefit either in late stage treatment or early stage treatment. Most of the data coming out from those clinical studies to date haven't shown an overwhelming level of evidence that it has benefits in those patients. Doesn't mean that it might still have some benefit in individuals or a case or two in different studies, or that physicians believe they see a benefit in their patients. But in the context of a randomized controlled study, we haven't seen an overwhelming level of benefit.
Have you reviewed the studies in other countries such as France and possibly Japan on these? I mean, are you, I just want to know, because my constituents ask these questions, do you take those studies into consideration when you make these decisions?
We absolutely do. We look at the quality of those studies. We look to see if they were done with the right controls in place and the right sample size. Was it statistically relevant, or was it just a few people, or was it 20 people, or was it 2,000 people? All of that adds to the power of the data itself. Many of the studies that we saw early only included a few number of patients, and so it was unclear, even from the description of some of those studies that were not in peer-reviewed journals, whether all the patients were treated the same, whether they had full participation throughout the clinical study itself. And looking at the statistical power of many of those studies, they were very small. So it's really difficult to understand the impact, the benefit. We also saw a study that the VA hospital conducted with hydroxychloroquine that showed people who were treated with hydroxychloroquine appeared to have a higher rate of death than people who are not treated with hydroxychloroquine. So that study too has weaknesses. No study is actually perfect. You take all of that evidence into account when you make a decision on how to further study the drug or how to use that drug.
It's my understanding that not my constituent, but a U.S. citizen a veteran, was cured. Again, this is just from what I've heard from the drug. That was a late stage case, but I've also heard of early stage cases as well. So I wanted to get that on record. Thank you, Madam Chair.
He yields back. Pleasure to recognize the gentlewoman from Florida, Ms. Castor, for her 5 minutes of questions.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Dr. Bright, thank you for speaking out to save lives. I read your whistleblower filing, and I want to ask you about the N95 respirators. These respirators are essential personal protective equipment. They're not the cloth mask or surgical mask that everyday Americans are encouraged to wear by the CDC. Dr. Bright, are N95 respirators necessary to protect the lives of nurses, doctors, EMTs, and those on the front lines?
Yes, they're required essential personal protective equipment to protect those frontline healthcare workers from getting infected.
And this is not a hypothetical concern. Just last week, the LA Times reported a tragic story about a heroic nurse, Celia Marcos, who appears to have died because she lacked an N95 respirator when she rushed into a hospital room to try to save a COVID-19 patient who had stopped breathing. And this brave nurse is not the only one. According to another report, over 700 staff at just one Detroit area health system have tested positive for COVID-19, and the CDC reported over a month ago that over 9,000 healthcare workers had already contracted COVID and dozens have died. And I checked with my Tampa Bay area health providers, and one Tampa hospital said N95s are still very difficult to procure. She said there's a dire need for N95s. One of my community health centers says we continue to struggle to get N95s. And there's so many folks trying to sell knockoffs. And then a large Tampa Bay area health system said the supply chain remains inconsistent and irregular, and Baycare remains concerned as we head into the fall for N95 masks. The demand will continue to increase due to the flu season and the continued presence of COVID-19. Dr. Bright, you understood that America would face a shortage of respirators in January. Is that right?
We understood America would face a shortage of N95 respirators for a pandemic response in 2007, and we have exercised and known and evaluated that number almost every year since 2007. It was exercised even as late as early as 2019, August, in Crimson Contagion, that we would need 3.5 billion N95 respirators in our stockpile to protect our healthcare workers from a pandemic response.
And you sounded the alarm repeatedly, but were ignored by the senior leadership at the Department of Health and Human Services. Please explain what steps that you took and the response you received.
We knew going into this pandemic that critical medical equipment would be in short supply. I began getting alerts from industry colleagues in mid and late January, telling me that from an outside view, from the industry view, that the supply chain was diminishing rapidly, telling me that other countries that we relied on to supply many of these masks were blocking export and stopping transfer of those masks to the United States. I learned that China was trying to buy the equipment from the United States producers to have it shipped to China so they could make more. In each of these alerts, and there were dozens of these alerts, I pushed those forward to our leadership in ASPR, to Dr. Cadillac and his senior leadership team. I pushed those warnings to our critical infrastructure protection team. I pushed those warnings to our strategic national stockpile team, who has the responsibility of procuring those medical supplies for our stockpile. In each of those, I was met with indifference, saying they were either too busy, they didn't have a plan, they didn't know who was responsible for procuring those. In some cases, they had a sick child and would get back to it later in the week. A number of excuses, but never any action. It was weeks after my pushing that finally a survey was sent out to manufacturers or producers of those masks, a 5-page survey asking producers or companies if they actually made those masks.
In your whistleblower filing, you discuss a February 7th meeting of the department leadership group at which you urged the department to focus on securing N95 masks. Can you describe what happened at that meeting?
They informed me that they did not believe there was a critical urgency to procure masks. They conducted some surveys, talked to a few hospitals and some companies, and they didn't yet see a critical shortage. And I indicated that we know there will be a critical shortage of these supplies. We need to do something to ramp up production. They indicated if we notice there is a shortage that we will simply change the CDC guidelines to better inform people who should not be wearing those masks, so that would save those masks for our healthcare workers. My response was, I cannot believe you can sit and say that with a straight face. That was absurd.
In fact, it took 3 months from your initial warnings until mid-April for the federal government to invoke its authority under the Defense Production Act to require the production of millions of more N95 masks. And even then, the administration required the production of only 39 million masks, which is far fewer than you and other experts said that we would need. What was the consequence of this 3-month delay and inadequate response? Were lives endangered?
Lives were endangered, and I believe lives were lost. And not only that, we were forced to procure these supplies from other countries without the right quality standards. So even our doctors and nurses in the hospitals today are wearing N95 marked masks from other countries that are not providing the sufficient protection that a U.S. standard N95 mask would provide them. Some of those masks are only 30% effective. Therefore, nurses are rushing in the hospitals thinking they're protected, and they're not.
Thank you for your courageous effort.
Gentlewoman's time has expired. A pleasure to recognize our colleague from Indiana, Dr. Bouchon, for his 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chairwoman, and thank you, Dr. Bright, for testifying. I appreciate it. I was a cardiovascular and thoracic surgeon and been in healthcare for over 30-some years, so I want to comment on, I'm not going to ask a question about hydroxychloroquine. I just want to comment on how the medical community responds to this type of thing. Doctors across the country will use drugs off-label in a circumstance where they don't have or they don't see a viable alternative to that. And I think this is one of those circumstances. I'm hearing from doctors across the country. And look, I'm with you. You have to have double-blind studies. You have to have proof under normal circumstances. But in this situation, I think a little bit of understanding and leeway from the federal government is in order. We do want to ensure the safety. This is a drug that has been proven safe for many, many years in the appropriate doses. It does prolong the QT interval, as you've outlined, which can lead to cardiac arrhythmias if not used properly. But I mean, tell you, when states tried to stop doctors from using this, there was such a backlash, they had to back away from it because the physicians in the community wanted to use it. And so doctors like me out in the real world, if things are working, even anecdotally, they're not going to wait for the government bureaucracy to approve it. I just want to get that on the record. I'm just saying this is why doctors are using this drug. Whether it's right or not, data will show. But, you know, if 2 years from now we have the studies and we say, hey, that stuff really would have worked, and the government stopped that from being used, if I was a family of a person that was stopped from getting hydroxychloroquine, I'd be pretty mad. I want to talk about the supply chain issues and as it relates to PPE, the personal protective equipment. And I think there's enough blame to go around in the federal government about what happened there. For, you know, after H1N1, where our national stockpiles were depleted, we didn't replenish them. We've had people on both sides of the aisle talking about this, and I think there's some blame to go around. But, you know, I don't want to be accusatory, but I do want to go over some of the facts about BARDA's situation as it relates to the masks, okay? And according to Washington Post report, in 2015, the Obama administration and a company now known as O&M Halyard, H-A-L-Y-A-R-D, announced a project to develop rapid pandemic mask production line. According to federal contracting records, in 2017, HHS signed off on a $3.3 million, with an M, payment to Halyard to build a machine that could churn out millions of protective respiratory masks at a high rate of speed during a pandemic. However, in September of 2018, CNBC reported that the machine was never built. And despite BARDA's $1.5 billion with a B budget, the Washington Post reported there wasn't money to pay for the project. Why was the project scrapped, and did you sign off on that decision?
So that project with Halyard was to build a novel new machine to make a respiratory protection face mask faster, as you described accurately. Right. Actually, the technical team must have reviewed that proposal on the next step or the further investment in that machine. I believe that the investment to date was made to design the machine, build the blueprint of the machine, and I'm not even sure if it was to build the actual
At that time, in September 2018, were you the head of BARDA?
In 2018, I was the director of BARDA.
Right, so did you sign off on the decision? Because I would expect a decision like that, a contract, money was allocated apparently from HHS to BARDA to do this. I wouldn't expect that to be scrapped without the director of BARDA signing off on that, right? So did you sign off on it? It's a yes or no question.
Not necessarily scrap the project, sir. I don't know what the proposal was, that we rely on a very thorough vetting process
Understood.
in our contracting office. So that proposal to further continue that project never made it to me. So if it wasn't approved, it didn't make it through the proper vetting process in BARDA. The decision to end or continue that project was not brought to me.
Okay, I find that surprising, but I'll take your word for it. Nicole Lurie, who hired you, told the Washington Post that the Halyard contract was part of an explicit strategy to ensure we could surge mass production in the next crisis. Well, now we're here and we don't have it. So we're dealing with the consequences of that decision. And in addition, I guess, to the Halyard, I keep saying that wrong. It is my understanding, well, I'm running out of time. So what I'm going to just say is, look, to doctors across America, you know, it's easy for us to sit in Washington, D.C., whether we're members of Congress or whether we're agencies, and talk in the abstract about people dying in our intensive care units. But when you're the physician at the bedside and there is a medication that has promise and that has a safety profile that we understand, doctors will use this medication offline. And that's what's happening. And you know, whether that's right or wrong, we might take us years to prove, but in the meantime, people can die. So I yield back.
Gentleman's time has expired. It's a pleasure to recognize the gentleman from Maryland, Mr. Sarbanes, for his 5 minutes of questions.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Dr. Bright, welcome back to this committee. The United States government deploys millions of dedicated public servants working together to achieve our shared goals as a nation, to promote effective government, and to protect the public interest, in this instance, to protect the public health. As a scientist and public health official, that was your charge, and you took it seriously. Unfortunately, the record shows that your superiors at HHS and potentially beyond, instead of valuing your expertise and experience, squandered it in ways that in this moment, in the face of this crisis, amount to gross negligence. They ignored your science-based pleas to pursue critical strategies, for example, your repeated calls to obtain virus samples from China and to find supplies, masks, respirators, swabs. They dismissed your science-based warnings about pursuing unproven strategies. They dismissed your concern, for example, about the stampeding towards hydroxychloroquine. We've heard about that today. And they sent you on errant missions to find treatments with little therapeutic value, all for the sake of satisfying political cronies. And you've testified about the miracle cure drug that was an example of that. Ignoring, dismissing your input was not harmless malpractice, because there's every reason to believe that if that input had been heeded, particularly your pleas for action in the early days of the pandemic, it might have saved thousands of lives. I want to thank you for coming forward. I want to thank you for blowing the whistle on the misguided and chaotic response to this pandemic. I am sure there are specific conversations, emails, moments in time that you remember like they happened yesterday, the inflection points where if the response to your warnings had been heeded, things might have been different. And I'm sure they haunt you and keep you up at night. From January of this year, tell me about just one specific moment when you had that sinking feeling in the pit of your stomach because you were not seeing the response that you knew needed to happen.
Congressman, I'll never forget the emails I received from Mike Bowen and indicating that our mask supply or N95 respirator supply was completely decimated. And he said, we're in deep shit. The world is, and we need to act. And I pushed that forward to the highest levels I could in HHS and got no response. From that moment, I knew that we were going to have a crisis for our healthcare workers because we were not taking action. We were already behind the ball. That was our last window of opportunity to turn on that production to save the lives of those healthcare workers, and we didn't act.
Listening to your testimony gives me chills because it all adds up to one inescapable conclusion. It didn't have to be this way. There was another path. Things could have gone differently. The federal response to the pandemic could have been much more effective. So here we are, at a moment when our country needs the kind of expertise and science-based guidance that you and others like you can offer us. These voices are too often being sidelined. Things are upside down. In you, we have someone who made the right call in the early days and has been removed from your position, while so many people who made the wrong call still have their jobs. Dr. Bright, when the counsel that you and others offer is cast aside, and I know you know this, it means that science and reason are also being cast aside. That's a dangerous impulse. It's an attitude that deprives our country in this critical moment of any real chance of getting ahead of this pandemic. But hopefully we can learn from this. There's still time to put science and reason back into the national strategy for fighting COVID-19. We need people like you to help lead us through this. The federal response has got to get smarter. It has to put science ahead of politics and cronyism and wishful thinking. Our committee will continue to press for that in the days ahead, and I know that you want to look forward. So tell us, what can we do now to learn from the mistakes of January and February and March and make sure that we navigate and lead our country through this public health crisis?
Congressman, we need to install and empower leadership. And we need to unleash the voices of the scientists in our public health system in the United States so they can be heard. And their guidances need to be listened to. And we need to be able to convey that information to the American public so they have the truth about the real risk and dire consequences of this virus. And they have the truth about the consequences of their actions if they don't follow those guidances. And we don't have a single point of leadership right now for this response, and we don't have a master plan for this response. So those two things are absolutely critical. I would also encourage Congress to ensure there is oversight in this response. Large sums of funding have become available to help us as scientists and others respond to this outbreak. And without proper oversight of those dollars, I'm concerned that they could be misdirected and lost and not put to the right fight. So I would urge Congress to continue and increase their oversight in how those funds are being spent and making sure they're prioritized and used appropriately to end this pandemic.
Thanks for that caution. I yield back.
The gentleman's time has expired, and he yields back. Pleasure to recognize the gentlewoman from Indiana, Ms. Brooks, for 5 minutes for her questions.
Thank you, Madam. Audio circuit for the Reuters live service. This is the primary audio circuit for the Reuters live service. This is the primary audio circuit for the Reuters live service. This is the primary audio circuit for the Reuters live service. Get that reauthorized, and it was signed into law in June of 19. Do you recall that?
Yes.
And Dr. Bright, you joined BARDA to lead the influenza division in 2010, right after H1N1, because of your expertise. And we rely on your expertise, and you became director in 2016. After, and you mentioned it in 2007, but after the 2009 H1N1 pandemic, the supply of masks in the Strategic National Stockpile was not resupplied. You've mentioned that actually we've had a problem since 2007. So, but I have to share with you, members like Congresswoman Eshoo and I who've had discussions, as members of this committee, did not know and were not told of these shortages of masks as we worked through reauthorization of this important law. Were you aware of this issue, and did you push HHS to maintain mass production for purposes of replenishing the Strategic National Stockpile before this happened in January?
Before 2017, we actually held an annual review of the Strategic National Stockpile that was chaired by Dr. Laurie at the previous ASPR. Since we removed the Strategic National Stockpile from the CDC management under the ASPR management, we have not yet had an interagency, cross-departmental review of the supplies in that Strategic National Stockpile. We went through an annual prioritization process. There's always been limited funding and never enough to completely top off the stockpile.
Did you know Greg Burrell?
I do.
He retired.
Yes.
Prior to all of this happening. He led the Strategic National Stockpile.
Yes.
Did you have conversations with Greg Burrell from 2009 until 2020 about what was in the Strategic National Stockpile?
Absolutely. The flu risk management meeting met on a monthly basis, and each year they reviewed and prioritized items that should be purchased by the Strategic National Stockpile.
Okay.
That body, which I actually directed for some time, made recommendations and prioritizations to the Strategic National Stockpile. However, it was the Strategic National Stockpile's responsibility to make those purchases.
And how about FEMC? Does BARDA participate in FEMC? And would you please, very, very briefly, because my time is limited, explain what FEMC is? This is a plan that experts like yourselves participate in. So I want the American people to know there have been plans. There have been plans that FEMC had forth a 2017-18 implementation plan. The White House put forth, in September of 2018, a National Biodefense Plan. Did you participate in that National Biodefense Plan?
I did, and many of us did.
And it was the first time that our country had actually put forth a National Biodefense Plan. Many said it was kind of landmark, and same thing with FEMC, putting forth many plans. So I want the American people to know a lot of folks over a long period of time have been focused, but yet we did not still have enough. We didn't have enough swabs, we didn't have enough masks, we don't have enough gowns for all of those incredible healthcare providers. So I don't want everyone to be given the impression that you raised the flag just in January, okay, when you saw it was short, because you hadn't gotten the job done prior to January, and you were at those tables, as were so many others. This happened over a very, very long period of time. And those of us have been very disappointed to learn what was and was not in the Strategic National Stockpile. I thank you for your service. I thank you for your expertise. But across the board, over many administrations, we did not do enough, and I yield back.
Do you want to respond, Doctor?
I could say that those plans have been in place, and it's disappointing they were not pulled out in January of this year and followed. They were not put on the table with a strong leader indicating these are our plans, everyone fall in line and follow through this plan. I think it's important to emphasize that the FEMC is the Public Health Emergency Medical Countermeasure Enterprise, which is comprised of many great scientists from across our government to put these plans in place. But since 2017, we have largely dismantled that FEMC organization. We have not had those interagency discussions for a number of years. The Executive Enterprise Committee and Executive Leadership Committee, we may have had 1 or 2 meetings at most in a new restructured or reorganized FEMC organization. So the partners and colleagues across government haven't had those venues to even talk or coordinate for a number of years to understand what that plan looked like and how they would work together to implement that plan when the day came to need it.
Okay, the gentlewoman's time has expired, and she's yielded back. Pleasure to recognize the gentleman from New Mexico, Mr. Lujan, for your 5 minutes of questions.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Dr. Bright, you've described pressure from senior Trump administration officials to promote the malaria drug chloroquine and hydroxychloroquine to treat COVID-19 despite the lack of scientific support for this treatment. According to your account, when Bayer offered to donate chloroquine pills to the strategic national stockpile on March 17, your team of experts at HHS determined that, quote, there are safety liabilities associated with the drug, close quote, and that, quote, accepting the donation could lead to widespread use that is not supported by any clinical data, close quote. Further, one of the public health experts advising you said, quote, no data available to support that chloroquine provides clinical benefit to the treatment or prevention of COVID-19, close quote. Yes or no, Dr. Bright, are there safety liabilities associated with chloroquine?
There are, yes.
According to your whistleblower complaint at the time of the Bayer offer, the consensus from BARDA and FDA scientists was that it was advisable to wait for additional clinical data before making any recommendations on the use of chloroquine to treat COVID-19. Is that correct, yes or no?
That is correct.
Yet on March 19th, the Bayer moved forward and announced the donation of chloroquine, and President Trump told the country at a White House press conference that the drug had, quote, shown very, very encouraging early results, close quote. Yes or no, was the president's statement accurate?
I do not think that was the best informed statement.
In that press conference, the president also said that the drug had, quote, been around for a long time, so we know things don't go as planned. It's not going to kill anybody, close quote. Yes or no, is that statement accurate?
The drug had been around a long time for its use in malaria, but it had not been around for a long time for its use in COVID-19 patients. That's a different indication, different clinical outcome, and the drug can behave differently in those people.
Yes or no, is it true that within days of that press conference, you received urgent instructions from HHS General Counsel passed from the White House directing you to obtain the authorization necessary to make the drugs widely available to the public?
That's true.
Yes or no, did the pressure from the White House and HHS General Counsel put you in a difficult position?
Yes.
And how did you handle this pressure while still trying to protect the American people?
We had to come up with an alternate solution that our administration would accept.
Yes or no, did the administration respect this compromise?
They accepted it eventually. The emergency use authorization option was accepted by Dr. Cadillac and the administration, yes.
What I'm aware of, and I would agree with that the HHS Assistant Secretary for Health, Admiral Brett Goyer, on April 4 said this compromise, quote, matters not, close quote, and that the drug needed to go to pharmacies as well as hospitals. Dr. Bright, there are only 24 hours in a day, and every hour you and your team had to spend on chloroquine is an hour you couldn't work on fighting this virus. Yes or no, did the president's obsession with this issue distract you and others on your team from your mission of saving lives?
The directive we received to prioritize and put an expanded access protocol in place within 48 hours was extremely distracting to dozens of federal scientists who were focused on the coronavirus outbreak. They had to set aside all other work to try to put together this protocol in the 48-hour directive time period.
Yes or no, did it distract from efforts to prepare for this crisis, including securing PPE and ramping up testing and the production of other essential supplies?
It distracted from their efforts in developing other vaccines and drugs and that they were focused on at that time. It was a different group of individuals who were focused on procuring PPE.
Dr. Bright, just yesterday, the president questioned the testimony of Dr. Fauci when discussing children and schools. The president insisted that, quote, it has very, very little impact on young people. Dr. Bright, yes or no, do we know that the president's statement is accurate?
There's a lot we don't yet know about this virus, and it's really concerning over the last few weeks that we're getting more and more data out of New York and other places where they've had high numbers of infections of the impact of this virus in children. It's very different presentation and outcome in children that we see in adults, and it's very concerning, and we don't yet have an answer for that, but we should proceed very cautiously and not have any hope or knowledge that we know everything about this virus.
Dr. Bright, I want to end by quoting your testimony, quote, without clear planning and implementation of the steps that I and other experts have outlined, 2020 will be the darkest winter in modern history. The darkest winter in modern history. Yes or no, do you believe this administration is doing everything it can to prevent the darkest winter, and what more should they be doing?
I believe there's a lot of work that we still need to do. And I think we need still, I know, we need still a comprehensive plan, and everyone across the government and everyone in America needs to know what that plan is and what role they play. There are critical steps that we need to do to prepare for that fall, for that winter coming. We do not still have enough personal protective equipment to manage our healthcare workers and protect them from influenza and COVID-19. We still do not have the supply chains ramped up for the drugs and vaccines, and we still don't have plans in place on how we distribute those drugs and vaccines, and we still do not have a comprehensive testing strategy so Americans know which tests do what to do with that information, and we know how to find this virus and trap it and kill it. There's a lot of work we still have to do.
Gentleman yields back. A pleasure to recognize the gentleman from Oklahoma, Mr. Mullen, for his 5 minutes of questions.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and I'd be remiss not to thank you for your continued prayers for my son. That's very kind of you, and I really appreciate it. Dr. Bright, you're here on your own time as an individual, is that correct?
Yes.
Where are you currently employed?
I'm currently an employee of the Department of Health and Human Services, and I'm in the middle of transition, I guess you would say, between BARDA and the NIH.
So you've accepted the reassigned position to NIH?
Except that this position is under discussion at this point. I have not yet accepted that role.
So are you currently being paid?
I'm currently being paid.
Where are you being paid from, out of BARDA or from NIH?
It's not completely clear to me, but I believe it's out of NIH.
So are you getting a paycheck since you've been over there since mid-April, right? Is that correct?
I've received one paycheck, sir.
What, from NIH?
I think it was still part BARDA and part NIH. I've had discussions about my onboarding process at NIH.
Are you, at BARDA, you made $285,000, is that correct?
That's true.
So how much are you currently making at NIH?
I don't think my salary has changed.
It's still the same? So you've been over there for approximately 4 weeks, a month?
It has been about 3 weeks since I was removed from my office at BARDA.
So have you reported to NIH yet?
I've checked in with the NIH Director's office, and we've discussed the onboarding process, the fingerprinting process, and we had a call just last evening to discuss a framework of my responsibilities that they have envisioned for me at NIH.
So you haven't actually reported to work, but you're still getting paid, correct?
I've been on sick leave since I was pushed out of my position at BARDA.
Sick leave for what?
For very high blood pressure, and I've been under treatment for my position.
For hypertension?
For hypertension, sir, yes.
So you're on medical leave?
I've been on medical leave. This week, however, I transitioned from that medical leave to annual leave so I can manage this.
What is annual leave? What do you mean?
It's vacation time.
So you're on vacation time right now?
I'm on vacation time.
Did you inform your supervisors about you coming here today, or did you need to do that?
I have informed them about my leave status, and I've had a conversation with them last night.
So you transferred from medical leave to vacation this week, or does it start next week?
I had a conversation with my physician about my hypertension and how we've been managing it over the last 3 weeks, because this has been very stressful to be removed suddenly without explanation from my role and position. It's a life change for me. And my physician has been working very closely with me to manage my hypertension and stress. And the conversation I had with him last night indicated
I guess I'm kind of confused there, because you say you have hypertension, but yet you were able to do these interviews, you're able to make the report, and you're able to prepare for this hearing, yet you're too sick to go into work, but you're well enough to come here, while you're still getting paid from the United States government. Is that correct?
Sir, I've been under medical leave until
I get that, but if you've been underneath medical leave, too sick to do that, but yet you can prepare for a 2-hour hearing, I just having a hard time tracking that. I have a hard time understanding that. And if you have hypertension and you're too sick to go to NIH, but you didn't ever experience that in BARDA, right? You never had issues in BARDA with hypertension?
I didn't have the level of stress of being removed from my position while I was in BARDA, so this has been very stressful. And my physician
I know, I get it. People handle
and we
pressure,
have been
people
working
handle
on
pressure quite
managing
different.
that.
But as a director of BARDA, I'd feel like you're in quite a bit of stressful position when you're trying to manage a pandemic, but you can't manage that, or you could manage that, but you can't manage your own hypertension when it comes because you got removed from the office, but yet you can still receive pay from NIH, but you can't show up for work, and then all of a sudden you can prepare for this, but you can't do that. I just have a hard time understanding it. I know you're a bright individual and very smart, but you are an employee of the federal government, and I just want to make sure you're not doing something to deceive the American people at the same time getting paid from the United States government. With that, I'm going to yield to our ranking member, Walden.
I thank the gentleman. Dr. Bright, your lawyer appears to have a pretty substantial binder there, and I know Mr. Guthrie asked about the documents that there are on the table. Are those the exhibits to your complaint to the Office of Special Counsel?
I don't know what these are.
I'll direct it to the council then, since she's answered other questions. Are those the exhibits to the complaint to the Office of Special Counsel?
Some are, and some are my work product, and some are my notes, and they're not appropriate to turn over to Congress.
So is it appropriate to turn over the documents that are referenced in the complaint, not your work product, I respect that, to this committee? And would you do that?
You asked that question initially, and I said we would look at the documents to determine whether they are appropriate to turn over.
I'm just talking about the ones that we have partial email chains, we have screenshots of emails. I think we should have the right to see those documents if we're going to effectively know the full extent of this complaint. And I just wish you would commit to turn those over. Dr. Bright, will you turn those over?
I think I addressed that.
Dr. Bright, I'm asking Dr. Bright now.
I've
Are you willing
submitted
to
my
turn
full
over?
complaint to the Office of Special Counsel, and that is the process I know to follow. So,
But you're here as an individual
Gentleman's
citizen.
time is expired.
Whistleblower, we just want to see what you've submitted so we can evaluate it ourselves.
Sir, I don't understand the full process other than I was supposed to submit it to the Office of Special Counsel, which I've done so. I don't understand the legalities of sharing that before they've had their opportunity to review that.
Well, they've certainly been shared out into the public and press. The Washington Post has them from some source. They look a lot like what's referenced in your complaint. None of us, I don't know where those came from, but other media outlets are certainly seeing them. I just think as part of this investigation, Madam Chair, you should request them.
We will seek all information that's appropriate to be submitted to the committee. And what I circulated, or we circulated to all members of the subcommittee were the emails that were public as well as the complaint. That's what was out there.
I know,
now,
but
I haven't
any other
tracked daily who
investigation-
says what. I mean, maybe Politico has something too. I don't know the veracity of things.
But the other
to address the outbreak. And because we had practiced, I came in with my list of needs, and those lists for money, people, and viruses. My request was met with a bit of surprise and puzzlement. I remember Secretary Azar looking around the room and saying, money, you need money, maybe there's money somewhere. I mean, it was just something that I could tell.
Despite the fact that we had had the outbreak in China for some time.
This was January 23rd at this point.
Could you describe January 25th, if you remember, email exchange with Mr. Bowen on the mask situation?
I don't remember that specific, but I'm sure it was urgent. I'm sure that Mr. Bowen was sending me a notice saying, asking if this.
So you didn't ask him to come and talk to you. He just reached out to you.
Yes, sir.
Okay. How about an email exchange with Dr. Kerr on January 27th? Did you reach out to Dr. Kerr? Did he come and wanted to
Dr.
email
Kerr
you?
reached out to me, I believe. This was because, again, he is a pandemic influenza expert as well, response, and he knows the vital nature of needing those viruses, and he was involved in prepping our secretary for a call he had with the Vice Minister Ma in China. And we knew a high priority was for our secretary to ask for those viruses. We've had challenges in the past in getting viruses from China from avian influenza strains and viruses. So this was a high priority. We needed that to get started. And he was alarmed when he wrote to me that morning indicating that the CDC director had reprioritized and actually indicated we did not need, or he did not need to, the secretary did not need to ask China for viruses. And it was alarming to us because we knew how critical it was.
Now that sounds incredible in light of what has transpired since then. So I guess my major point here is that we have a brave individual coming forward as a whistleblower, but he is not alone. There are many other experts, scientists, and manufacturers that realized we were in, if I may say, deep shit not a long time ago, long before the administration and the White House began to wake up. What do you think would have happened if Mr. Navarro had not reached out to you and actually responded to you? Where would we be now if you hadn't been able at least to get one person in the White House's attention?
It's difficult to speculate where we were. So even when Mr. Navarro reached out and strongly suggested that action be taken on February 10th, and February 9th is in the email, February 10th, it was conveyed to Dr. Kadlik that we needed to ramp up production of N95 masks. That order did not go out, that solicitation did not close till March 18th. So even with the pressure of Mr. Navarro, who I believe shared a sense of urgency about this outbreak, that pressure alone still did not spur Dr. Kadlik and our strategic national stockpile into that urgently needed action.
Well, that's very disconcerting, and the reason we're here today, perhaps. Last question, if I may, and switching gears and going to the other side of the spectrum, while it's been hard to get folks' attention here in Washington, D.C. and the administration on the seriousness of this, I think most people now are convinced this is a very serious issue. And I'm a little concerned we're going too much the other way in terms of information. You alluded to it here on the vaccines. I think some people are under the impression there's a vaccine going to be developed in a couple of months and everything's going to be fine, I can go back to work. And we unfortunately have to juxtapose economic issues. They have to have realistic expectations at home. And you, I think, accurately indicated, well, it can take up to 10 years. And, the quickest we did, I guess, was Ebola, and that was, I believe, 5 years. So, is it tough question to ask? I suppose you don't have to answer. But I mean, I don't want America to think they can just not get back to some semblance of a new post-COVID life until a vaccine comes out, because that could take years. And there's a chance the vaccine will maybe not be as effective, much like our flu vaccines that, with the flu mutating year to year, sometimes. So I just want to make sure that ask you if you would agree that we can't wait to open up America entirely until a vaccine is there. We have to use some of the other parameters you've already suggested.
We have to make sure that we have some scientifically led and driven decisions on how and when it's safe to reopen America. If it happens before we have a vaccine, if we have a vaccine faster, that's great, but if we do need to open America up sooner, we need to make sure everyone understands the risk and understands the risk of their activities, and everyone has to play a critical part in following those activities to reduce the risk. We have to have a testing plan in place and enough tests to make sure that we know when people are exposed so they can be quarantined and isolated and not continue to infect others. And we also are developing a number of therapeutics that could offer some potential benefit prophylactically or protect you almost like a vaccine before you're infected. And those are being developed and maybe even faster than a vaccine. And if healthcare workers and frontline workers can use those therapeutics, then that might offer them some protection as well until there is a vaccine. So there's a number of steps in between now and a vaccine. I believe if we let science lead the discussion and we inform America of the risk and the clear guidance on what needs to happen, and people follow that guidance, then there is a stepwise process to getting back to work and back out of our homes.
Great.
Gentleman's
Thank you very
time
much.
has expired, and he yields back. Pleasure to recognize the gentleman from North Carolina, Mr. Hudson, for his 5 minutes of questions.
Thank you, Madam Chair. First, let me say I believe any whistleblower should be respected and allowed to be heard. That is a core component of keeping our government accountable and running smoothly. But this hearing is not about a whistleblower complaint. It's about undermining the administration during a national and global crisis. That's evidenced by the fact this hearing is being held in the wrong subcommittee and well before the Office of Special Counsel finishes its work. To disregard the minority so spectacularly in the organization of this hearing only highlights the partisan and political nature of this hearing. I hope today will be held up in the future as a lesson of what not to do and the respect and gravity that should be given to whistleblower complaints so that they're not abused for political expediency. More importantly, though, we have vital work we should be doing. My constituents want Congress to get back to work. So I'm glad to be here to highlight the important work that needs to be done. I heard from an ophthalmologist in my district this week about the need for relief. She says she'll consider this year a success if her practice group even breaks even. Long story short, we should be examining the $175 billion authorized and appropriated in a bipartisan manner for providers and what providers still need and recommendations for moving forward. We should also be examining why there are gaps in outcomes and access for minority communities. Fayetteville, North Carolina, in my district, has a large and diverse community, and understandably, the folks back home are scared because coronavirus hits them hardest. Why are we not spending our time today examining this crisis within a crisis more closely? I hear from providers and hospitals about issues with PPE. I know this administration has done extraordinary things to secure more PPE. I want to thank President Donald Trump for his strong leadership. Not only did his administration move quickly to coordinate a response, but his travel ban on January 30th was a bold move, though it was panned by his critics as an overreaction at the time. The administration has gone to great lengths to overcome an inadequate system they inherited. And as you testified earlier, moved quickly to start programs like Project Airbridge to expedite more PPE coming in. But questions remain about why there is a global shortage and what more Congress can do to support the administration's efforts to secure sufficient PPE. This committee should be working on that question. We have multiple pieces of bipartisan legislation waiting to be considered to improve the operations of the strategic national stockpile. We should be examining why our stockpile was allowed to dwindle under previous administrations. The answers to these questions and solutions to these problems are timely and critical to helping this administration combat this virus and the deadly disease it causes. I hear from constituents every day who are suffering under these stay-at-home orders. This crisis is hard for anyone, who, even if they weren't suffering from substance use disorder or mental health challenges before they were confined to our homes. And this crisis has exacerbated this problem. Why are we not examining access issues to mental health providers and the effects this crisis has had on our constituents' mental health? Dr. Bright, you're no doubt an accomplished scientist, and I appreciate the service you've rendered this country. You deserve to be heard, and your whistleblower complaint should be given the serious consideration any whistleblower complaint deserves. But we also deserve to have the opportunity to ask questions about serious allegations that have been made against you. And I'll note again, this is not the time or place for that hearing. The time is after the Office of Special Counsel has completed its work, and the place is the Oversight and Investigations Committee. But Dr. Bright, building on questions from a lot of information and context regarding agency decisions to acquire hydroxychloroquine, you chose not to elevate your concerns to the Office of the Inspector General, but instead kept selected screenshots that didn't include full context. Another example, the Wall Street Journal reported on an email today that seems to show that you were in support of acquiring and using hydroxychloroquine. Can you elaborate on what was missing from your screenshots and why you didn't elevate your concerns at any time to the Office of Inspector General?
So the early days of when I was aware of the hydroxychloroquine, we were interested in acquiring that drug for its use in a randomized controlled clinical study. Actually, when I heard from Dr. Woodcock that it's something that we should try to investigate in a randomized controlled study, I even reached out to a company that was licensed and approved to make that drug in the United States to see if they could donate that drug to the NIH to conduct those clinical studies. I was aware of other efforts that were ongoing to try to acquire some of that drug for its use in randomized controlled clinical studies. as long as it was going to be used at that time for those randomized controlled clinical studies, I thought we should look into the supply chain the same way I did with Remdesivir. It was only after I learned that that supply that was being discussed was coming in from Pakistan and from India, from facilities that were not approved by the FDA, and the drug was not approved for use in the United States, that I became increasingly alarmed of having that drug in the United States. Second, it was when I learned that the plan was to make that drug available through an expanded access program so people could potentially get that drug and not be under the close supervision of a healthcare provider. That caused significant concern. It's because of that and the cascading days afterwards that we put in that emergency use authorization with the safety bumpers and barriers that we could feel comfortable with, that that drug would only be used under close clinical supervision. But in the earlier days, in that email exchange that you're referring to, was before we knew about this information in Pakistan, before we knew it was going to be used for expanded access protocol. It was when I thought our efforts to obtain some of that drug would be used at the NIH to conduct randomized controlled clinical studies. So I was relieved that we did identify some supplies of that drug for those clinical studies.
My time's expired, Madam Chair. I yield back.
The gentleman yields back. Pleasure to recognize the gentleman from Massachusetts, Mr. Kennedy, for his 5 minutes of questions.
Dr. Bright, thank you very much for being here, and thank you for your service to our country. Let's ground this hearing a little bit. As of this morning, which means these numbers have increased, there's nearly 1.4 million cases diagnosed of COVID-19 in the United States and over 80,000 fatalities. Experts believe both of those numbers are an undercount because after 5 months of this virus being on our shores, we still have a systemic problem with regards to robust testing. Is that right? Cases in many states across the country are still actually increasing in number despite that lack of testing. Is that right? You've mentioned in your testimony that, quote, we missed early warning signs and forgot important pages from our pandemic playbook. Is that right?
Yes.
Sir, you've been the head of BARDA since 2016. Is that right?
Yes.
Until recently. Have you experienced any pandemics prior to this one over your course of time, either there or in your prior government service?
We responded to the Zika outbreak. We responded to the Ebola outbreak. They didn't rise to the level of pandemic.
Of course not.
But yes.
Right. Thank you for the clarification. Sir, you're aware at the end of the Obama administration, the Obama team put together a playbook to try to guide succeeding administrations on how to handle an outbreak, correct?
Yes.
Sir, you're also aware that there's a simulation done from an outgoing Obama administration in January 2017 with an incoming administration about how to respond to a pandemic. Is that right?
Yes.
And you're aware that the Trump administration cut the number of CDC staff located in China from 47 to 14. Is that right?
I don't know the exact number. I know it was reduced.
Okay. And sir, you referenced already the simulation called Crimson Contagion. That was a simulation done by HHS begun in January of 2019. Can you shed just very briefly a little bit of light as to what the findings of Crimson Contagion were?
The significant findings, it was actually, the participants were beyond HHS, it covered broad areas of government and federal and state and locals. Some of the significant findings were the need for improved coordination and communication and alignment between the federal and state and local tribal territorial governments, and the significant need for personal protective equipment and the shortage and a significant need for funding initially.
And sir, that simulation was based off of a flu-like virus that was initially detected in China, spread by global air travel, and resulted in the infection of 110 million Americans, leading to 7.7 million hospitalized and nearly 600,000 dead. Is that right?
Yes.
Sir, when did you first have concerns about the potential impact of COVID-19 on the United States?
In early January.
And were you aware that your supervisor, Dr. Cadlick, suggested that the activation of the Defense Production Act in mid-January?
I wasn't aware of him doing that, no.
Okay. Well, you mentioned that you had 2 meetings with Secretary Azar. I'm sure you had others, but you referenced so far in your testimony meetings on January 23rd and 27th, where you raised concerns directly to the Secretary. Is that right?
Yes. The secretary was not at the second meeting. Deputy Secretary Hargan was there.
Thank you. You're aware that top National Security Council staff, including National Security Advisor Mr. O'Brien and his deputy Matthew Pottinger, raised significant warnings that China was downplaying the impacts of this virus.
I did learn of that in the meeting at the White House, yes.
You're aware that we sent 17.8 tons of medical supplies to China in early February.
I've learned of that.
Are you aware that the Trump administration budget proposal released in February of 2020 called for a cut to CDC by nearly $700 million?
I'm not aware of that. I've heard of it.
Are you familiar with a memo written by Peter Navarro that warned of the impact of the virus?
Yes.
Are you aware that it was spread among senior administration and White House officials?
Yes.
Are you aware that it was on or about April 2nd when the Trump administration finally activated and expanded the Defense Production Act, months after being warned by you and other senior administration officials?
I've learned of that.
Are you aware that that order itself did not extend to the full authority of the DPA and left a haphazard allocation process to states and hospitals to compete against each other?
I don't know the details of that authority, sir.
Has the Coronavirus Task Force actually developed a plan for reopening the country?
I'm not aware of the full plan to reopen, sir.
Have they developed some principles that the White House has touted as some principles or guidelines as to how to reopen the country?
I've heard of some principles.
Are states following that plan?
It doesn't appear that there is a nationwide coordinated plan that states are following, sir.
So after this recitation of the actions and inactions of this administration over the course of the past 6 months or so, can we possibly say that this administration has prepared our country for the moment that we are in, and how we could possibly be prepared for the distribution, development, manufacturing, and distribution of a vaccine to try to address 330 million Americans over the course of the months ahead?
I think we have a lot of work to do to be prepared, sir. I
You're
don't think
too
we're
kind.
fully prepared.
Thank you, sir. Yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Pleasure to recognize the gentleman from Missouri, Mr. Long, for his 5 minutes of questions. Okay.
We can go to Curtis.
Should we go to? You want to pass?
I think we're going to reserve, yeah.
Okay, you can reserve, and we'll go to the gentleman from California, Mr. Cardenas, for his 5 minutes of questions.
Okay. Thank you, Dr. Bright, for being here today. And I just want to tell you that my family, my community, and myself, we appreciate your 25 years of focused service, specifically when it comes to addressing pandemic outbreaks. And it's my understanding that you've spent those 25 years leading teams of scientists when it comes to drugs, diagnostics, and vaccine development. And we appreciate that. When an administration or decision makers prioritize politics over science, does that tend to increase or decrease the likely results of the loss of life in the middle of a pandemic?
I believe the scientists are best equipped to understand how to manage a public health crisis, and I believe scientists should lead.
And therefore, to my question again, I'll phrase it differently. If the scientists are not leading and the politicians are leading with the final decisions when trying to address the issues of pandemics that are taking people's lives, that way of handling it, does that likely increase the loss of life, or is it likely to decrease the loss of life?
I believe the scientists leading will actually increase the likelihood that we can survive this pandemic and move through it. So if scientists are not allowed to lead and speak up, I believe it could increase the loss of lives.
Thank you. How many times in your career have you personally, actively said, I need to enact my right to be a whistleblower?
I'm sorry, could you repeat that?
How many times in the last 25 years have you decided to enact your right to be a whistleblower?
This is my first time, sir.
Okay, I knew that answer was simple, and I think I confused you because I made it so simple. And the reason why I want to say that is because I believe that you've been incredibly consistent in your willingness to dedicate yourself, your expertise, and your career to saving lives. Is the loss of life on your mind? Was that on your mind when you decided that you needed to enact your right to be a whistleblower?
I've spent my career focused on saving lives, and sir, everything I've done to come forward now is to raise awareness of challenges we have, things that are not getting done, because I do think it will save more lives.
Okay. Are you aware of the fact that the lack of testing in the United States of America is affected by many pieces of the puzzle in order for people to get testing, whether it's swabs, whether it's N95 rated equipment for the caregivers to be able to enact safely with the public? Are those all factors that have contributed to our lack of having adequate testing in America?
They are factors, sir. I don't think anyone has thought through the entire plan completely to understand those critical components for testing. I think there's a lot of confusion about the different types of tests, and I think our national narrative is focused on a number of tests, and it's not about the number so much as the right types of tests, and Americans know how to use them and what they do with that information. And no one has really thought through the raw material supply chain to make sure we can sustain the need to test.
Okay, that sounds a little confusing from somebody who actually has been working at a high level of the United States government in this space that we're discussing at this moment. So my question is, if we are not implementing in this pandemic to the degree or ability that the United States should or could, what's contributed the most to that? Was it the lack of scientists recommending up the chain of command, or was it the people at the top of the chain of command deciding to do things differently than the scientists are strongly recommending?
There's evidence of scientists raising concerns about shortages and other actions that are important to take that were not being taken. It's a different level. In my personal situation as the leadership at HHS, and I asked for Dr. Kadlik, that I believe was dismissive of the early warnings that I was raising.
Okay, and you said early warnings, and despite the early warnings, have there been other examples where warnings and strong recommendations were either being ignored or set aside and other actions were taken?
So I believe that I've learned of others. I mean, the CDC's written several guidelines for reopening America and getting people out of their homes and back to work, and I'm not sure if all of those guidelines have been reviewed or being publicly considered at this point. So there's another example of, I think, really hardworking career scientists and their information and their hard work not probably getting the proper vetting and proper exposure to the American public.
Well, one of the things, I have no idea how much time I have because the clock's been flipping back and forth, but hopefully I have a little bit of time. We've heard boasting from the White House about millions of personal protective equipment, PPEs as everybody knows them as. Millions have gone out to America. But fact, to date, we should have had billions gone out throughout America. Isn't that the disparity?
There's a huge disparity, and healthcare workers are having to compromise their protection and their health and safety because they're having to be creative and reuse a single mask for the entire week or come up with novel sterilization practices that are not proven or tested yet. So that disparity actually is impacting our frontline workers, and those are the people whose lives we really need to preserve so they can treat others.
I have family members who are working in hospitals today on the front lines who have been telling me that they are wearing equipment for days at a time that they're supposed to be disposing of several times a day, and they're having to use them over and over.
Expired.
So thank you very much, Madam Chair, and if somebody could do a better job of the clock,
Yes.
I'd appreciate it. It kept flipping back and forth. I was trying to...
You're absolutely right. It got stuck at 4:44, went to 0, and popped up to 1:21, so I'm watching too. My father was a watchmaker, clock repair man. Where is Daddy when we need him? A pleasure to recognize Mr. Long from Missouri for his 5 minutes of questions.
Thank you, Madam Chairwoman. And Dr. Bright, you contend that your removal was because the Trump administration and HHS leadership in particular lacked scientific integrity. Do you think that Dr. Fauci lacked scientific integrity?
Sir, I don't think my removal has anything associated with Dr. Fauci at all. I think my removal was because of tensions and actions I took between my supervisor, Dr. Cadlick, and myself.
Do you know about Dr. Fauci's testimony 2 days before at the Senate Health Committee?
I'm aware of that testimony, yes.
If HHS leadership is so hostile to scientific integrity, as you say, as you allege, how do you explain Dr. Fauci being allowed to testify forthrightly, to serve in a prominent role on the White House task force, the administration, and direct NIAID's extensive research efforts?
So I'm not sure what decisions are involved in allowing Dr. Fauci to testify or not. That's not something.
Can you say that again?
I'm not sure. I'm not aware of what process or decisions are involved in allowing Dr. Fauci to testify or not.
But he was allowed to testify.
I know he was, but I thought I understood you to ask me if that was appropriate or if he was not being allowed to. Maybe you can repeat your question if I misunderstood it.
Okay, what I'm saying is you're saying HHS is hostile to scientific integrity. And if that's the case, can you explain why Dr. Fauci was allowed to testify forthrightly in the committee? If they're hostile to, why would you let him come out and testify without any no holds barred?
I'm saying that my supervisor was not following proper scientific process that we have in place for BARDA. I'm not actually saying the administration is hostile against scientific integrity in all cases. So I'm saying in my particular situation, as in my claim, my supervisor was conducting an inappropriate activity that was going around proper scientific vetting. That is what I put in my claim.
Why did you not bring these concerns to Secretary Azar or his chief or the Inspector General? Why did you not bring any of them into the loop and say, hey, I have these concerns?
Sir, some of the activities were not isolated with Dr. Cadlick. I think some of his senior staff was also aware of some of the processes that were being utilized to go around our traditional review process, scientific review process.
But wouldn't normal protocol in any situation be that you go to the Secretary of HHS or his Chief of Staff or the Inspector General with your concerns instead of just gathering them up and deciding that one day you're gonna?
Well, I didn't decide that. I was pushed out, sir, and involuntarily transferred without my knowledge.
But you had these concerns, so why didn't you take them to your superiors when you had the concerns? And maybe none of this, maybe we wouldn't be here today. It wasn't easy for any of us to get here today.
Sir, I requested that an IG investigation, as is my claim, I think it was in 2018, that they look into what I believe was inappropriate pressure, political pressure on some of our contracting activities in discussion about procurement integrity. And I do not think that that was ever followed through on. So
Did you bring your concerns to the Inspector General?
I do not believe they were followed up through and submitted to the Inspector General. I raised those concerns to our HHS.
But you personally didn't talk to the Inspector General, didn't raise the concerns with the Inspector General or with Azar's chief or with Azar, correct?
I raised those with the Secretary's Office of General Counsel. They were present in that meeting, sir.
I'll take that as a no. Okay. You state in your testimony that HHS leadership was dismissive about your predictions about the broader outbreak and the pressing need to act. However, it's my understanding that it was Dr. Redfield at CDC who alerted the White House's National Security Council about the risk of the virus on January the 2nd, and a high-level team with the NSC's Counterproliferation and Biodefense Directorate quickly began meeting to address the possibility of a pandemic. Do you consider Dr. Redfield's actions here to be dismissive about the threat of a coronavirus?
Sir, people were aware of the urgency. What was lacking was the action and how to address the urgency. So when we were raising issues on critical supply chain of medical equipment to protect doctors and nurses, if they're aware of the urgency of the situation and still failed to act I think that is even more unconscionable than not being aware of the emergency and not acting.
Okay. In your new position, I would recommend that if you have issues, you might go to the head of the department, his chief, and some folks like that. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Pleasure to yield to the gentleman from Vermont, Mr. Welch.
Thank you very much. Your job, our job, is to protect the American people. And this fierce virus can be managed if done correctly, correct?
I believe so.
And in fact, the playbook is established. It's testing, contact tracing, and then isolation, starting with first social isolation, correct?
Yes, as non-pharmaceutical interventions and testing are critical first steps.
Right. And in fact, this virus is across the world, and many countries that have followed that tried and true protocol have done far better than the U.S. Is that correct?
We have seen differences in the response and the outcomes of that response around the world.
I'll go through some of those. And, you know, the Johns Hopkins study that said that the U.S. had the best preparedness, it turned out we have the worst response, correct? With the most cases and the most deaths.
We have the most cases and the most deaths.
And I did some calculations. You know, on January 19th, South Korea determined its first case. On January 19th, the U.S. determined its first case, correct?
January 20th was the U.S., yes.
All right. And if we had the same response as South Korea, by population, they had 33,000 deaths. We would have saved 50,000 lives. In Taiwan, they had the same virus, 22,000 deaths. And again, adjusting for population, that's 60,000 more deaths we've had here. Singapore, 82,000 more deaths. New Zealand, 65,000. The question for us here and for the American people is why? When we had the best plan, we had the worst execution. So let me go through a few things that you've established. One, beginning in January, before that first case here, FDA Chief Hahn asked the HHS if he could start contacting companies about possible shortage of protective equipment, and he got blown off by HHS, correct?
That I understand.
And on January 18th, before our first case, you pushed Dr. Kaldek to convene high-level meetings about the virus, but that was initially rejected, correct?
True.
And then on January 23rd, you demanded urgent access to funding personnel and clinical specimens to develop life-saving medicines, but you were told that the spread was under control, correct?
There wasn't a shared sense of urgency.
On January 25th, you warned others in the administration there's a critical need for procuring surgical masks. That was ignored, correct?
True.
On January 27th, you participated in the daily COVID-19 meeting where you expressed frustration with the slow pace of accessing virus samples and clinical specimens from China. You were reprimanded and you're no longer part of those meetings. Is that right?
That's true.
So you and others actually were seeing over the horizon what was coming to our shores, even before our first case was confirmed, correct?
We had spent many years preparing for a pandemic, sir, and we understood the threat, and we understood what we needed to do.
Exactly. It's knowable and it's manageable. It's fierce and fearsome, but what you have to do is established. Is that more or less correct?
Yes, sir.
We just didn't do it. February 25th, President Trump gave an assurance that the stock market is starting to look very good and the coronavirus was very much under control. Were you aware of any medically involved people who had the view that the virus at that time was very much under control?
No, sir, I don't think the virus was under control. I don't think many people would agree with me in the scientific realm.
Now, in those countries I mentioned, it includes Germany, Taiwan, New Zealand, South Korea, Singapore. The leaders of those countries accepted that there was a role only the nation could play, and the provinces would have to depend on them for that. And I want to go through some of those things. One, establishing a testing protocol. Was that done here?
No.
Two, acquiring and allocating and distributing the personal protective equipment to where it was needed, when it was needed. Was that done here?
No, sir.
In fact, we had governors and hospitals competing with each other to try to get desperately needed equipment. Isn't that correct?
There's a lot of confusion, a lot of competition, and bad decisions made to acquire poor quality product.
In any of those other countries that I just mentioned, are you aware of the leader of that country at a press conference making recommendations on what kind of medication people should use?
I don't know the details of what happened in those countries, sir, so I don't know.
All right. Now, we had governors here, Republicans and Democrats, Republicans like Hogan, like Phil Scott from Vermont, who have done a tremendous job. But no matter how good they do their job, can they protect their people without the aggressive intervention of the federal government playing its role?
I think the federal government plays a critical role in coordinating and aligning and making an equitable distribution of those critical supplies. I believe that's what we'd practice and exercise in the past, that there would be a critical role for the federal lead in coordination at the state, local, and tribal and territorial levels.
Thank you, Dr. Bright. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Pleasure to recognize the gentleman from Georgia, Mr. Carter. Do you wish to question, or do you want to pass? You reserve, okay. The gentleman from California, Mr. Ruiz, is recognized for 5 minutes of questions. Dr. Ruiz.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Bright. Thank you for your testimony here, and thank you for your service to our country. My heart aches for the family and friends of the over 80,000 in America who have died of COVID-19 in such a short period of time. In fact, my heart aches for those closer to me. The Riverside County has reported 228 deaths. As a doctor, I appreciate your written testimony that states that science, not politics or cronyism, must lead the way to combat this deadly virus. There's been a lot of hype about cures for COVID that have been shown to be ineffective and even dangerous. We are now seeing the very real dangers and consequences of not making decisions based on science. Hydroxychloroquine, which Fox News commentators and then the White House repeatedly touted and actually encouraged people to use, is Exhibit A on this list. But there is one drug that appears to provide some therapeutic benefit, Remdesivir. 2 weeks ago, Dr. Fauci announced that Remdesivir showed a clear-cut, significant positive effect in diminishing the time to recovery. My understanding is that in January and early February, you launched a comprehensive review to assess which existing drugs might prove a therapeutic benefit, and you quickly identified Remdesivir as the most likely drug to be effective against COVID-19. Can you describe how you came to that conclusion, who you told within HHS, and what the response was?
Yes, so that conclusion came about by a technical review from a number of scientists within HHS, the CDC, FDA, NIH, and BARDA, but it was also aligned with a scientific assessment from WHO and a number of global experts who rapidly looked at every potential drug and ranked Remdesivir as the drug that had the most potential for benefit.
Who did you tell, and what was the response?
We shared that information with Dr. Kadlik. We shared that information within HHS leadership as well. We had discussions about the actions that could be considered for acquiring the limited supply of Remdesivir.
So what was the response?
And we had discussions about how to ramp up production of more Remdesivir in case the randomized controlled clinical study that the NIH was conducting came through with positive.
And so you had a discussion, and what was the response? Did anything happen?
No decision was made at that time.
My understanding is that Peter Navarro, the White House trade advisor, reached out to you on February 7th to seek your counsel. You told him about your top 3 concerns: the shortage of N95 masks, the need for a quote-unquote Manhattan Project to develop vaccines, and securing adequate supplies of Remdesivir. Can you tell us if Mr. Navarro agreed with you and what steps you and he took?
Mr. Navarro did agree with me on the Remdesivir, the N95 mask, and the Vaccine Manhattan Project, and he drafted a memo on February 9th to the White House Chief of Staff and Mick Mulvaney to share with the White House Task Force.
The directive for HHS to act on Remdesivir occurred on February 10th. What happened next? And did the department promptly procure the needed supplies of Remdesivir?
We did not proceed with procuring any supplies of remdesivir.
Okay. You were removed from your position on April 22nd. By the time you were removed, had the department settled on a plan and procured the remdesivir?
No, sir, they were still discussing slide presentations about potential donations of remdesivir at that time.
So what you are describing is a gang that couldn't shoot straight, and yet we are in the middle of a pandemic. There is one drug the experts say could make a difference, and in fact has been shown to make a difference, yet the department can't seem to figure out how to acquire it. A week ago, the Washington Post published an article on the rollout of remdesivir, describing it as, quote, confusing, unfair, and marred with incomplete medical information, unquote. Doctors described how they can't obtain the drug and don't understand the process for accessing it. Dr. Benjamin Linas from the Boston Medical Center said, quote, there's no transparency. The process is just a staggering injustice. Dr. Bright, you were warning about this over 3 months ago. If the department had listened to you and the other experts at your agency, could this fiasco have been avoided?
We would have had a plan, sir. We should have had a plan for that drug and any other drug in limited supply.
So it didn't have to be this way.
Right.
Here's what I don't understand. You were right about the dangers of hydroxychloroquine. You were right about the benefits of remdesivir. You were right about N95 masks and other critical issues. Yet you got fired from your job while officials who botched the response and ignored your warnings stay in theirs. Not only is this unfair to you, it's completely dangerous to the American people. I yield back my time.
The gentleman yields back. I'd like to clarify something just very quickly relative to your leave, Dr. Bright. Are you on accrued vacation time now?
I'm sorry.
Are you on accrued vacation time now?
I'm on approved vacation leave today, yes. I talked to that.
And would you be willing to share the exhibits once you personally, once you remove personally identifiable information?
Congressman, I'm having trouble understanding you through the mask.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Sorry.
I'm getting so comfortable wearing a mask, I forgot I had it on. Would you be willing to share the other exhibits once you remove personally identifiable information?
Yes.
Thank you. All right.
Chairwoman, we will make them available after the hearing today when we've had a chance to review it.
Thank you.
Well, Madam Chair, will they be made available to the minority as well as the majority?
They'll be made available to the entire committee.
Perfect.
We've never shared anything with the majority that hasn't been shared. This is a bipartisan issue.
Thank you.
Madam Chair, if there's anything in those exhibits that hasn't already been released to the public that might be degrading, will that be kept in confidence amongst committee members?
I'm sorry, I didn't hear you.
Not knowing what's in the emails, I'm wondering if there's any information in there that might be deemed to be degrading, would that be kept in confidence amongst the committee members as opposed to being released to the public?
We'll follow the rules.
And that is in compliance with Rule 11. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Okay. I now have the pleasure of recognizing the only pharmacist in the United States Congress, Mr. Carter.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you, Dr. Bright, for being here, and thank you for your service to our country. And before I begin, let me extend my condolences to those 80,000 plus who have lost their lives and to their families as a result of this pandemic, and a shout out to all of our healthcare professionals, as well as our other essential workers who have put their own health in danger in order to provide services to our citizens. Dr. Bright, it's my understanding that in 2017, BARDA funded a project with Applied Research Associates of Albuquerque to develop respirators that could be sanitized and reused during public health emergencies such as what we're going through today. However, according to recent reports by the Washington Post, none of these next-generation respirators are available for us today. Why is that? Do you have any idea?
I'm not aware of that. So you're talking about the ventilators, sir, that we developed? Or?
That's correct. I'm talking about those that were developed, the respirators that were developed and could be sanitized and reused during public health emergencies. It's my understanding that that was contracted and that that project was scrapped.
Sir, I'm not familiar with that project, re-sanitize the respirators.
You're not familiar with that project, and you didn't sign off on that project to your knowledge?
I'm not familiar with that project, resanitize respirators.
Okay, fair enough if you're not familiar with it. Let me ask you this. We've had a lot of discussion today about hydroxychloroquine, about chloroquine, and I'm a little bit confused here because it's my understanding that this is what BARDA, do you want to clarify something here? I see you. Okay. It's my understanding that that's what the role of BARDA, the mission of BARDA is to look at things like this. In fact, when we in Congress allocate money to go toward this, that you are supposed to be looking, that BARDA is supposed to be looking at things that could possibly have merit, such as hydroxychloroquine and chloroquine. And early on, it appeared that you embraced that. And early on, it seemed that you were in favor of looking at that. And I'm just wondering, because of this pandemic, because we didn't have any vaccine or any kind of agreed upon treatment, we should be testing, and that's what we are appropriating that money for. Would you agree with that? That that's what we are trying to do, is to look at what could possibly work and work with public companies to try to encourage them to come up with those kind of solutions?
Absolutely. We should look at all options and make sure we evaluate the potential risk and safety and benefit of those in the context of a randomized controlled clinical study. In the context of emergency, we should move swiftly and get that clinical data as urgently and quickly as possible, but we should not proceed recklessly without that clinical data on its potential adverse events in an emergency.
So you're referring, when you say we should not proceed adversely, you're referring to hydroxychloroquine and the chloroquine?
We were promoting the standing up of randomized controlled clinical studies at the NIH with hydroxychloroquine. I worked with a company to even ask if they would donate drug to the NIH to be used in the context of a randomized controlled clinical study.
Right.
Yes, so that is what BARDA would do.
And in fact, I think you worked with the FDA to get an emergency use for hydroxychloroquine, is that correct? And it was actually approved by the FDA.
That was in the context of the directive we received from the Secretary's office to stand up an expanded access protocol. Our clinicians.
So are you saying you were instructed to do that and you did it against your will, or?
So we were instructed to put in place an expanded access protocol. So in the context that Americans would be able to access this drug and not be under the close supervision of a physician. The scientists at FDA, NIH, CDC, and BARDA worked together to change that directive to the context of emergency use authorization with guardrails in there so patients would be under the close supervision of a physician.
Understood. Let me ask you this. Initially, you appeared to be encouraged by what could possibly be a result of the effect of hydroxychloroquine. When did that change? When did you sour, if you will, on the use of hydroxychloroquine?
I believe that we've seen many drugs that could have benefit, and some of these are really interesting things we'd never heard of, some we have.
I understand that, but my question was, when did you sour on it?
When it was determined that this drug should be made available to Americans outside the context of a close physician supervision. So I supported conducting a randomized controlled clinical study for hydroxychloroquine at the NIH. When I learned that there is a directive to make it more broadly available, not under close supervision of a physician, I was...
When was that? When did that directive go out?
That was March 23rd.
And that's the time that you decided, no, this is not what we should do, and we should not be looking at hydroxychloroquine at all.
I didn't think that was the proper, safe way to evaluate that drug in the context of this outbreak. I believe that should be only done under close supervision of a physician. When we put the EUA in place that locked this drug down to only be used in patients under close supervision of a physician, we were satisfied we had those guardrails in place. When an email string followed a week later saying, ignore the EUA, push this drug into the retail pharmacies in New York and New Jersey, that's when I became more concerned.
And who put that directive out?
The gentleman's time has expired.
Who put that directive out?
The gentleman's time has expired. You can answer, Dr. Bright.
Which directive, sir?
That it should be put out to the public without physicians approving it.
That directive was an email string that had a number of individuals on it, and I believe it first came from Dr. Giroir, the Assistant Secretary of Health. It indicated the White House was asking for that drug to be more broadly available.
So was it because the president was encouraged by the use of this drug that you became discouraged by it?
It had nothing to do with politics, sir. I wanted to make sure that Americans were aware of the risk of this drug. It was only available under very safe...
But it is a drug that is indicated and has been used safely in the past.
By almost 1.5 minutes. You can finish your answer, Dr. Bright, and then we're going to move to the next member.
The drug had been used safely for malaria for a number of years. We didn't have a database of...
But it's being used in the same dosage as it was used for malaria.
Please, please. And I know that I'm overly generous with both sides of the aisle, but I think that we need to move on. I mean, 2 minutes of extra time is 2 minutes of extra time, and I'm not going to ask that it be shared over here. The gentleman's time has expired. It's a pleasure to recognize the gentlewoman from Michigan, Ms. Dingell, for her 5 minutes of questions.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thanks you to both you and Ranking Member Dr. Burgess and Dr. Bright for your being here today. You're doing a great service. I think we're here today because COVID is real. I share the sentiments of many of my Republican colleagues that have expressed the thanks to the frontline workers asking questions. I want to look at the last few months. COVID's really real in my state. Michigan's the 10th largest state in the country, and we were third in the number of cases for weeks. We were third and remained there until this week in the number of deaths. We managed to move to 4th place 2 days ago, which is not a number anybody wants to be. My family alone, a cousin woke up with 104 temperature and was dead that afternoon. There are people still dying every single day. I have lost someone I've known. Sunday, Monday, a brother-like friend to me, Tuesday and Wednesday. And then we hear the scientific experts, yourself, but Dr. Fauci, other scientists around the country saying to us, if we don't listen to them, we could begin to see well, we're going to see a return. You call it a dark winter. I call it, I don't want to see any more spikes. I don't want to see anybody else die. I am losing too many friends that I know, and people across the country are. So I want to focus on an area that's not your area of expertise, but it's mine, car safety. We expect our cars to be safe, and we expect car manufacturers to be responsible in making sure defective cars aren't sold. And if they fail in that responsibility, we hold them accountable. If an engineer in a car company realized a model had serious defects and warned her management about that, we would all think she had done her job responsibly. And if management ignored her and our committee found out, I will bet you right now we would be having hearings. And if Americans died driving those cars, the companies would be sued and they would be charged with criminal negligence. In fact, several years ago, before my time, this committee investigated airbag defects and vehicle safety. At the time, this subcommittee's ranking member, Dr. Burgess, said, there is no room for going slow when it comes to safety. And certainly, deception cannot and will not be tolerated. Dr. Burgess was right then, and our car makers have to be accountable. But what I'm concerned about is that we aren't applying these same standards to coronavirus. And I want to learn from what's happened so we keep that dark winter you're talking about from happening. It seems to me, Dr. Bright, you acted the same way the auto engineer I mentioned should act. You identified serious problems and then suggested fixes when it came to diagnostics, N95 masks, other equipment, and medicines. Is that right?
That's true. And, Congressman, we still have those challenges.
Do you believe if your suggestions were implemented, lives would have been saved and the severity of the pandemic might have been lessened?
I believe lives would have been saved if we had proper medical protective equipment for our healthcare workers. Yes.
So people died because you weren't listened to?
People died because they didn't have appropriate protective equipment to save their lives and protect them from getting infected.
The problems aren't limited to just ignoring your advice. The American people are confused, given mixed signals, and quite frankly, some days just simply deceived. Let me give you an example. There was a visit to the CDC on March 6th, and at that visit, the administration said, anybody who wants a test will get a test. Was that true then?
There still are not enough tests.
So even this week, as we're being told, anybody who wants a test can have a test. Is that true in the United States of America?
No.
In fact, all the experts say we're doing is only a small fraction of the tests we need to do to reopen safely. I'm running out of time, so let me ask you about vaccines. We keep being told by the White House that we've heard very soon, quick numbers, a matter of months for that vaccine to be developed. This is your area of expertise. You are a top immunologist in the world. Was there any scientific basis to suggest in March that we'll have a vaccine in the next few months?
There's a lot of optimism. There's a lot of hope, but that doesn't make a vaccine. There's a lot of work that needs to be done to make a vaccine.
Will we be able to vaccinate people in the next few months?
It's very unlikely.
Thank you, Doctor.
Gentlewoman yields back. It's my understanding the minority is passing, reserving. With pleasure, I recognize the gentlewoman from New Hampshire, Ms. Custer.
Today, I want to thank you for your courage, for helping us to do our job to protect the American people. I want to start today by restating what I said at a hearing February 26th with Secretary Azar, right here, right at that table. The key to a public health crisis is trust and credibility. On that day, I urged Secretary Azar to provide clear, credible updates from this administration to the American public. However, your whistleblower complaint and testimony today unveil unheeded warnings about personal protective equipment, testing supplies, and vaccine supplies. Over the past several months, I have held countless conversations with doctors and nurses and hospitals and community health centers and our Republican governor and every other person in New Hampshire trying to get access to personal protective equipment, to protect our frontline workers, to protect our grocery clerks. We've been trying to get testing supplies, and we were told that because we were not a hot spot, we were on our own. And we literally had to turn to entrepreneurs, thank God they exist, and thank you to them for flying to China and bringing us the equipment we need that should and could have been distributed had we planned ahead. These conversations have informed my roadmap to recovery on how to safely reopen our economy. And key to those efforts is adequate testing, contact tracing, supported isolation, and vaccine development, your specialty. So I want to focus on your role as Director of BARDA in vaccine development and distribution. On page 28 and 29 of your addendum to your complaint, it states that BARDA estimated that between 650 million and 850 million needles and syringes would be needed for a vaccine to be administered here in the United States, for everyone to be safe. Your team at BARDA also estimates it could take up to 2 years to manufacture these vaccine delivery supplies. To your knowledge, Dr. Bright, at this time, has the administration placed any orders to prepare for how a vaccine will be delivered when one becomes available to every American?
I learned that they placed an order, the first order for needles and syringes on May 1st, and another order is placed today.
And were the amounts adequate?
I believe that it's for 320 million needles and syringes.
And could you please describe the situation if every American does not have access to the vaccine due to a supply shortage?
That situation would be catastrophic, honestly. The decisions have not been made yet who to vaccinate first, how to identify those individuals, and how to stretch those limited supplies appropriately. And
Let me
it's
ask you a
important to
simple
remember
question.
that it's not just the United States, so there's limited supplies. When I said it would take 2 to 2.5 years to make those, that was assuming there wouldn't be global competition for those limited supplies. Those are not made in the United States, some of them, so.
Does a lack of preparation in vaccine supplies make us more vulnerable to future spikes in COVID-19?
Absolutely.
And do we have enough supplies to distribute both the flu vaccine next winter as well as the coronavirus vaccine?
It's going to be extremely challenging.
Do we know yet of the interactions of the full-fledged flu season in combination with COVID-19?
We haven't seen that yet. Luckily, in this spring, flu was winding down when COVID-19 was emerging.
And without adequate supplies to vaccinate all Americans for COVID-19, does this slow down the goal of fully reopening our economy and getting back to the normal that every American wants?
It certainly brings caution and a significant consideration that must be taken into consideration before reopening. We need to make sure that not only the guidelines for reopening are clear to each individual, and each individual follows those guidelines. Otherwise, it puts us all at risk.
So can I ask you a question? And I know you're not political, and certainly we are all trying not to be political. In fact, I'm very proud in our state that our delegation and our governor are working so well together. But Dr. Bright, does this virus give a damn whether a patient is Republican or Democrat?
No, it doesn't. This virus just wants to infect people, and unfortunately, a lot of those people get really sick, and many of them die.
Thank you. I'm so grateful, not just for your knowledge, for your humility, and for your service to our country. Thank you, and I yield back.
Thank you.
Gentlewoman yields back. Minority reserves. Pleasure to call on the gentlewoman from Illinois, Ms. Kelly, for her 5 minutes of question.
Thank you so much, and thank you for being here and your patience. As chair of the Congressional Black Caucus Health Brain Trust, I'm deeply concerned by the disparities that this pandemic has brought to light due to our nation's history of discriminatory policy leading to differences in health outcomes for people of color. Time and time again, when resources are scarce, some communities are forced to do without the goods and services they need. You identify multiple situations in which the United States would face a shortage of supplies needed to respond to COVID-19, from masks to swabs and other testing materials, and potentially the supplies that deliver a vaccine when one is ready. During COVID-19, we've seen some states forced to pay significantly more because they're on their own to procure those medical supplies. Not every state or locality can afford to do this. Knowing what we do know about how scarce resources are procured and distributed, what impact will shortages have on lower income communities?
The shortages will impact across all of America, and unfortunately, it actually increases the concern in communities that aren't part of the mainstream or might have lower socioeconomic status. So I think it has a significant chance of increasing the risk in those communities.
How have you seen this impact the devastation of the disease in these communities?
These communities have, the data are showing that they're hit very hard, and we don't actually have the information yet to understand fully what's behind that or why, and it has health status or access to health care or other immunization status or health care status. So we're still learning a lot about that. However, it's really important to think about when we have diagnostic tests and other things available, that they are available to everyone. And many of these tests that we're developing today are very expensive or in very rare supply. So we need to make sure that we're developing and making available tests that are not just rapid and accurate, but low cost, and so everyone who needs a test can access those tests.
Did you attempt to urge HHS leadership or the administration to consider preparedness, outreach, or targeted resources for these populations, or are you aware of any HHS administration actions to target resources outreach to these vulnerable groups?
I've had some conversation. There have been some conversations, I should say, focusing on groups that are harder to reach in a different socioeconomic status. I'm not sure that there is a solidified plan in place just yet to make sure that it's more than a conversation.
Doesn't sound like there is. In your testimony, you recommend establishing a national standard and coordinate equitable distribution of equipment and supplies. Will this help to ensure that every community can access the equipment and supplies they need?
That is what's needed.
Will more equitable distribution of equipment and supplies help to address the inequities we're seeing in the impact of COVID-19 on communities of color?
Yeah, absolutely.
And do you feel in the last bill that we passed, we made sure that there was passed in the bill better data as far as race, and not just who died, but who was hospitalized and so on and so forth, because we're hoping that better data will inform policy. How do you feel like that'll help?
I think that's very important. I think it's a wise move.
Okay, good. And we're supposed to get a report 21 days from when the president signed the bill, then 30 days, and then 180 days.
I'm not aware of those guidelines. It comes in a different area, but I think reporting and oversight of that is important.
And then lastly, you've been sitting in that seat for a while, but is there anything that we haven't asked you that you want to say?
It was a really important question, and I've thought a lot about that. I think to highlight the things I talked about in my opening statement is we need transparency in the science, and America needs to know the truth. This is a devastating pandemic, and not just for health, but also society, our economy, our jobs, our livelihood. And if we do not take seriously the call for action to put specific things in place, a coordinated national plan for testing and response, and equitable distribution of these limited supplies, and ramp up and prepare for what will be a very devastating fall if we don't have the right supplies in place and raw materials, then this virus will overcome us in significant ways still. So we have limited time. My message is we have limited time. We have the ability to do it. We have the greatest scientific minds in our country to do it. We need to listen to them, put the plan in place, and everyone get busy stopping this virus.
Right. I know it's very, I've had 3 people in my family with it, and I lost my uncle maybe like 10 days ago now from the virus, so it does definitely touch everybody. Thank you, and thank you for your patience.
Thank you.
The gentlewoman yields back. Minority Reserve. All right, then we'll go to the gentlewoman from California, Ms. Barragan, for her 5 minutes of questions.
Thank you, Madam Chairwoman. Dr. Bright, one striking aspect of your account in your complaint to the Office of Special Counsel is the contrast between the public updates by the President and Secretary Azar on COVID-19 versus the analysis you and other experts were providing behind the scenes. I'd like to explore this disconnect and ultimately that the administration shared information that I believe was misleading. We need to do this to better understand what happened and how we can ensure that the administration provides the public accurate and constructive information going forward. Dr. Bright, you had learned of the COVID-19 threat by early January, is that correct?
Yes.
And according to your complaint, it was clear to you almost immediately that the, quote, virus was highly contagious, spreading rapidly, and could have a high mortality rate, end quote. Is that correct?
We were learning that from the outbreak in China at the time, yes. And each day we learned more information. It was actually more concerning.
And the World Health Organization confirmed your view that the virus was a big problem in a January 20 call to agencies, including HHS. Over the course of January, you pressed HHS leadership about the urgent need to devote increased resources to address the outbreak. On January 23rd, you briefed Secretary Azar directly that funding, personnel, and clinical specimens, including viruses, were critically necessary to begin development of life-saving medicines needed in the likely event the virus spread beyond Southeast Asia. Yet, on January 24th, in a tweet regarding the virus, the President asserted, quote, it will all work out well, end quote. On January 29th, Secretary Azar reportedly told the President that the epidemic was, quote, under control. And the President echoed that comment publicly the following day. This disconnect between the analysis of public health experts and the public statements by the administration leaders continued through February. Let me give you some more examples. In early February, you continued to raise the alarm bell. within HHS about the imminent mass shortages and the lack of preparations for the wave of infections that you saw coming. Thank you for doing that. Yet, in public remarks on February the 10th, President Trump stated, "It looks like by April, in theory, when it gets a little warmer, it miraculously goes away," end quote. Then he added, "I think it's all going to work out good. We only have 11 cases, and they're all getting better," end quote. You have said that experts knew that the number of N95 respirator masks needed to protect healthcare workers and other Americans in a pandemic was close to 3.5 billion. Yet, in testimony on February 25th, Secretary Azar said the U.S. would only need 300 million N95 respirators. That's an order of magnitude so much less than what you stated. Throughout February, you continued your warnings. I would say that your hair was on fire about the dangers of millions of Americans faced from this virus. But on February 26, President Trump characterized the number of cases this way, quote, "When you have 15 people, and the 15 within a couple of days is going to be down to close to zero, that's a pretty good job you've done," end quote. By March 10th, there were over 1,000 diagnosed COVID-19 cases in the United States, and over 30 deaths had been attributed to the virus in this country. Yet the president that day told the country, quote, "It will go away. Just stay calm. It will go away," end quote. He couldn't have been more wrong. Today we have over 1.4 million cases. Dr. Bright, what impact do you believe that statements by the administration leaders downplaying the COVID-19 crisis throughout February had on the ability of our public health system to mount an effective response to the COVID-19 virus?
I believe Americans need to be told the truth. I believe that the best scientific guidance and advice was not being conveyed to the American public during that time. I believe by not telling America the truth or being fully transparent, regardless of where the information was coming from, people were not as prepared as they could have been and should have been. We did not forewarn people. We did not train people. We did not educate them on social distancing and wearing a mask as we should have in January and February. All of those forewarnings and all those educational opportunities for the American public could have had an impact on further slowing this outbreak and saving more lives.
Well, thank you, Dr. Breyer. I want to thank you for sharing your perspective with us today. I hope that over the course, I hope that your courage in coming forward helps our country forge a better path than the disastrous course chartered by this administration to date. I yield back.
Gentlewoman yields back. Minority reserves. Pleasure to recognize the gentlewoman from Delaware, Ms. Lisa Blunt-Rochester. 5 minutes for questions.
Thank you, Madam Chairwoman, and thank you, Dr. Bright, so much for your testimony, but also for your courage here today. As you can hear from our colleagues, there is not a person in this room or in this country who hasn't been personally touched by COVID-19. And your statement that we need to be told the truth is probably the most important statement we've heard all day, because we know that if we don't face it, we can't fix it. So I want to personally thank you on behalf of all Americans for your courage to testify before us today. And I want to say that my focus for this hearing is really on three things. Number one, what have we learned? Number two, what do we need to do now? And number three, what can we do to prevent or mitigate the risks of an additional wave of COVID-19? It's clear since January of this year that there has been a failure on the part of the administration to use the scientific evidence that's been presented by the nation's top public health officials to take comprehensive, and I'll use that word again, comprehensive, appropriate, and urgent action to respond to COVID-19. One of the most pressing outstanding needs that has yet to be addressed is the need for a national testing strategy. Dr. Bright, in your testimony, you mentioned the need for such a strategy that ensures tests are, among other things, available to everyone who needs them. I, along with Congressman Colin Peterson and Representative Vela from Texas wrote a letter to the Democratic and the Republican House leadership in the House and the Senate, and we really impressed upon them the need for outlining the importance of a robust testing plan for testing and tracing. And while current testing capacity is 1.6 million diagnostic tests per week, healthcare experts say that we're woefully short of the estimated 30 million tests per week that we need to get America back to work as safely and confidently as possible and to avert or mitigate a second wave of COVID-19, which is one of my biggest concerns. Dr. Bright, what are the immediate steps that HHS needs to be taking to ramp up testing capacity now through the fall, and what targets should they be held accountable for?
I think what's really interesting about the testing story that gets lost in the narrative sometimes is the confusion about the different types of tests. There's an antigen test that tells you if you have the virus in you. There's a PCR test that says if maybe there are fragments of the virus, and there's this antibody test that looks at your antibody titer to try to tell you you've been exposed already, maybe immune to the virus. There's a lot of confusion, and I think the first thing HHS needs to do is determine which of those tests is most important to achieve which objective. If the antigen test is what's needed because it's faster and lower cost and more readily available in some cases, what does it tell Americans? What does it tell employers? What does it tell schools about the potential for an individual who has a positive or negative on that test and their potential to have a different result the next day or later that day? There's a lot of confusion about these tests. So I think the first thing that HHS should do is determine the type of test and how that test would be used effectively. And then make sure that we have enough of those types of tests and they're in the right place, and the people using them know what the data tells them and how to use it effectively. I think there's a lot of confusion there, and they need leadership in HHS to distinguish those challenges and clarify that for the American public. It's not just a test. There are many different tests, they tell you different things.
Thank you, thank you. And why do you think that our nation has struggled with ramping up the testing capacity, unlike other countries? And were there contingencies in place or a backup in light of this situation we're in now?
I think part of the struggle is waiting too late to think about it and to get it started. When we've had conversations with some manufacturers, they've been very creative in how they can ramp up. Another part of the challenge is we've allowed many of these capabilities to be offshored. And so we have much more capability of expanding domestic capacity when it's in our country, and we can ramp up and bring innovation to those companies in the U.S. But if the supply chain is offshore and there's a global need and competition for that supply chain, that also significantly impairs our ability to ramp up.
Again, I just want to thank you so much for the time that you have contributed to our country, but also for your courage to be here right now. Many of us are challenged as Democrats and Republicans to make sure that our country is safe and healthy, and it really is, I don't think I've ever in my lifetime seen anything like this, and it does require us to look back and at the same time look forward and make sure that we have what we need as a country. So I thank you again, and I yield back the balance of my time.
The gentlewoman yields back. Does the minority reserve? All right. Then it's a pleasure to recognize the gentleman from Illinois, Mr. Rush, for his 5 minutes of questions. Do you have your microphone on?
Yeah, I have it on now.
Good. Now I can hear you. Okay.
I want to thank you, Madam Chairman. Dr. Bright, it's so good to see you. I've been watching you this morning, and it just amazes me about your courage and your insight and your commitment. And I'm just so delighted to be in the same room with you. Your contributions are impressive, and your reports of how the scientific process was pushed aside for short-term political points are extremely troublesome to me and to the American people, I'm sure. I'm absolutely convinced that both you and the Chinese doctor, Dr. Li, the doctor who first raised the alarm over the coronavirus in Wuhan, China. You two will be remembered as two titans of this pandemic. You took the path that was right rather than the path that was easy. And I commend you for it. And that said, Dr. Bright, it's been widely reported that President Obama's White House National Security Council left the administration a detailed, very thorough document on how to proceed to a pandemic. And did you have any input in that playbook?
Yes, sir, I did. A number of our agencies across the government had input in that playbook.
And as far as you know, has any of those recommendations been enacted upon in this administration?
I believe some of those principles have been reviewed and considered, but I think the playbook has changed in this outbreak. I don't think they followed that playbook.
Like you, I think it's critically important that we focus on the path forward. While we must learn from the past and correct injustices as they occur, our response has to be forward-thinking, forward-moving. And I'm the sponsor of a bipartisan COVID-19 Trace Act. I have been working on developing a comprehensive $100 billion strategy for mobile testing and door-to-door tracing. And my legislation, my bipartisan legislation, empowers community groups to hire and train and pay workers to engage in testing and contract tracing. It prioritizes hotspots in medically underserved areas, as well as entities who hire locally. And as such, I was very interested in your views on a national testing and tracing strategy. In your testimony, you said, the virus is out there. It's everywhere. We need to be able to find it, to isolate it, and to stop it from affecting more people. And with that, I could not agree with you more. While my question may be outside of the scope of the NIH or BARDA, I believe that it's a question that is relevant to today. And I'd like to hear more about what you, as an expert on pandemic outbreaks, believes should be our national strategy for testing and tracing.
So I think it's important. You're spot on that we need to have a strategy that everyone follows the same strategy to test for where the virus is, who's infected with this virus. And then we have to appropriately isolate that person and quarantine them so they don't infect others. We rapidly need to trace their contacts to understand who they may have been exposed to and be able to test those individuals. And if they've been infected as well, we need to be able to isolate those. Through a concerted, coordinated effort across the country, we can be able to identify where that virus is, who's been exposed, give those people proper treatment and isolation, and can slow the spread of this virus significantly. But that has to be in a coordinated way. We have to have the right tests and enough of those tests. It's not something we do once and we're done. It's something we have to continually do in a community. So it's not just that we need one test for every person in America. We need multiple tests and the right types of tests. We need the right types of individuals and professionals who know how to use those tests to trace the individual contacts and to isolate that virus and stop it from spreading.
Well, I certainly thank you so very much, and thank you again for being here and letting the American people know what really is going on in our nation with this pandemic. I thank you, and Madam Chair, I yield back the balance of my time.
Thank you.
Gentleman yields back. There is no request from the, you're out of speakers, okay. It's a pleasure to recognize the gentleman from Arizona, Mr. O'Halloran, who is a member of the Energy and Commerce Committee. And according to our rules, we can, as members of the full committee, we can waive on to a subcommittee. And so we welcome you this afternoon and recognize you for 5 minutes of questions. Put your microphone on.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And Dr. Bright, thank you for your remarks today, your insight, your knowledge, and your caring for the American people. You have touched on several concerns I share with my colleagues about how the United States has responded to COVID-19. We must address the health crisis head-on if we want to tackle the economic crisis that has overtaken our country. We are going to need a coordinated, as you mentioned, national testing and contact tracing plan spearheaded by the federal government to prevent states from competing with one another for resources and planning for hotspot attacks and other issues that will come up. This is the only way that people will feel safe returning to work, eating at restaurants, enjoying Arizona's public lands, and being out in public and close to others. This flexibility piece is critical, and you can't have that unless you have a coordinated process. In my district, the Navajo Nation has for months been going under this process. And it's 170,000 people. The area is the size of West Virginia. So they're not all gathered in a group. So this fallacy that only urban areas are impacted and that it can't spread very fast. 16 people died yesterday. And in fact, this on a per capita basis, this currently has more cases than any state in the country. And yet this hotspot is still not being addressed in the appropriate way. More resources are needed, and they're needed now, and they were needed more than a month ago when we started trying to get this done. They continue to struggle to see the federal government's promised payments each in a timely manner. It came through finally, but it has to be timely in order to respond. This will bolster the health system and provide people with water, food, and supplies during this time of great crisis. Dr. Bright, as an infectious disease expert, what is the one thing that the federal government must do to ensure that hotspots like Navajo Nation or anywhere else in our country are successfully mitigated in a timely way, that this virus does not continue to spread throughout communities, and to bring back the faith of the citizens of our country to be able to understand that we will respond quickly with the necessary supplies?
Congressman, that's an excellent question. I believe that there's a need to recognize that it is a hot spot and understand the per capita outbreak of a number of infections in different areas and not treat every area in the United States the same. The rural areas, the less dense areas are not the same as a dense city such as New York City. However, you could have just as significant of challenge in a rural area or a less dense area as you described in Arizona. So I think the first recognition is to get the data across the country into the federal government so they can make the right prioritization decisions and allocation, equitable allocation of those limited supplies and resources to areas such as yours with a hotspot area. I don't think there's a full recognition yet of how to define necessarily the hotspots in a standardized way across the country. So we need to have the scientists review this challenge and come up with an equitable distribution and recognition of those areas.
Thank you, Doctor. I want to point out that this enemy goes much faster than one of our jet planes. Our fighters go fast, but this goes microseconds. One person to another, and it passes on and on and on. So I appreciate your comment. But statistics have to be relevant and timely in order to be able to do that, and it needs a central database. Dr. Bright, we are currently seeing the number of COVID-19 tests that are being administered increase nationwide. What major hurdles stand in our way from increasing our testing capacity quickly, moving forward, and how can the federal government address these now or within a quick period of time? It's taken, White Mountain Apache are going through a hot spot right now in my district. They cannot get tests. And they've had 400 cases out of 14,000 people. I mean, this is a critical issue, please.
I still think we need to recognize the importance of the different types of tests. And when we identify those different types of tests are essential for what we need to do to isolate the virus or identify people infected with the virus, then we need to put all efforts into ramping up production of all supplies for those tests. We've found many times that we've ramped up now test production, but we have not thought about the critical reagents that accompany those tests. We haven't thought about the swabs. We're asking equipment, diagnostic equipment that might normally run 100 tests a day to run 10,000 tests a day in a 24-hour period. So there hasn't been a real thought-through plan about how to maintain that equipment. That equipment now is failing in many places. So as we ramp up capacity to test, and we haven't thought all the way through the raw materials and maintenance of that equipment, those supplies, then we can find ourselves in a few days down the road not having the tests we thought we had, not having the supply we thought we needed. So again, this is where a coordinated strategy and plan for testing comes into place. Not just how to use the test, but how to make sure we're sustaining that supply. How to make sure that we've thought of every component, if it's a swab, if it's a buffer, if it's a lubricant for the instrument itself. Making sure that all of those things are considered and in that national strategy so we don't ramp up in one area and crash in another. We have to ramp up in all areas at once.
Thank you, Doctor, and Madam Chair, I yield.
Seeing no other members to speak, I want to close Dr. Bright. You've been here for just shy of 4 hours of straight testimony, and my observation is the following. I think that you are the finest ambassador in our country for scientists. Your encyclopedic knowledge, the depth and the breadth of it, I think as the American people have listened this morning, that you have given them confidence. You've also issued your warning. And I pray, and I sincerely mean that word, I pray that we will work together successfully so that that window that is closing, we will optimize the time that we have while it is still open. You know, facts are really stubborn things, and sometimes it's uncomfortable to have to deal with the facts that we're facing. But the United States still has more cases, more deaths by far than any other nation on earth. And by that definition, we have, in my view, a profound failure. You have given this committee a roadmap today, and we all have been witnessed your integrity. So thank you for your service to our country. Thank you for your willingness to testify here today. Thank you for your courage, which has raised your blood pressure with all of the what one contends with when you become a high-profile witness. But I think you should rest assured that you've made a difference today. And on behalf of all of my colleagues, I thank you and salute you. And thank you for your family being here as well. Thank you.
Thank you.
I'll ask the, yes?
Just was going to ask if I could be recognized for concluding remarks.
Yeah, I'd be glad to. Dr. Burgess,
Thank
you're
you.
recognized.
And as I outlined at the beginning of this hearing, there are a number of things that we do need to look into, and I hope that we will. This crisis has been going on for several months. We had an hour tacked on to a budget hearing at the end of February, and then this is the first glancing blow we've had against this crisis. So I welcome the hearing today. I think it's important. I appreciate Dr. Bright being here. I appreciate him bringing his guest. I do think we need to look into the issue of testing. I simply do not understand how the CDC got so far behind the curve at the beginning, and I would like to know that. But I also feel like there has been, in previous administration, there was an effort to really regulate what are known as laboratory-developed tests and move those away from CLIA-regulated products to FDA-regulated products. And that really did put us behind. The innovators have now stepped up. I'm thankful that they have, but we shouldn't have excluded them in the first place. And I think that was, when we look back on this, that is going to be one of the failings at the federal level. And that's not a recent failing. That goes back to guidances and rules that were issued back in 2012, 2014. As far as testing is concerned and the ancillary supplies, there are tests that might just involve taking a salivary sample. That'd be great. Spit into a cup, not have to deal with one of those obnoxious swabs going halfway down your throat. I suspect those cups are probably in greater supply and more readily available. And then, Dr. Bright, you'll remember I had an interaction with you in March. I've had people pounding on the door with all kinds of ideas. I have people that want to make personal protective equipment. They turn their furniture shop into a PPE manufacturing shop. They had difficulty getting through the bureaucratic cul-de-sacs at the various federal agencies. I've got a man that's got a breathalyzer test for COVID-19. I don't know whether it works. If it does, it's pretty intriguing. A mobile unit about the size of a bread box that you could take from place to place. You simply blow into a tube and we'd have to have more straws. We've outlawed them recently, but that could be dealt with. There are some innovative things out on the horizon. The vaccine worries me too, because I recognize there's some illnesses for which we have never found a vaccine. H1N1, and I realize that's different because that was a flu vaccine, but that did happen in about 8 months, if I recall correctly. The outbreak happened at spring break. We didn't know if we were going to be able to open the schools in September, but the vaccine was generally available mid-September to early October, depending on what part of the country you were in. So that success story gives me some hope that perhaps there is going to be light at the end of this tunnel in the form of a vaccine. But I do welcome that we had the hearing today. I look forward to a number of additional hearings. The ranking member of the full committee was quite correct to invoke Rule 11. We will keep that as an option going forward. And I thank our witnesses for being here today, and I'll yield back.
The gentleman yields back. Thank you again, Dr. Bright. And the first panel has completed testimony, and I just ask the staff to prepare the table for our next witness, and then we will begin in just a few minutes.